Welcome to the podcast that's dedicated to making you a faster cyclist, the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by Trainer Road. I'm Coach Jonathan Lee at a packed table today. Our head coach, Chad Timmerman, is here.
All right, buddy.
And our product manager and Cannondale's Amber Pierce is here.
Hello.
Good to have you here. And our CEO, Nate Pearson.
Sponsored by Trainer Road. Hello.
Yeah, exactly, right? Aren't we all at this point? That's actually the only spot. We get questions about sponsorship for this podcast all the time.
Could you tell?
And strangely, you can join us on YouTube, and then you will be able to tell for sure. You can do that. It's usually every Thursday at 8 a.m. Pacific, but it is Christmas Eve, so we are recording early this week, and we're just getting it done here today, so you can have some good Christmas listening. A couple things to cover really quick, some job postings. We have React and React Native engineers, right, Nate? You can go find this on trainerroad.com/jobs.
Correct.
C# engineer.
Correct.
And if you are local, customer support team.
Local to Reno, Nevada.
Yes, then we can. We'd love to have you join us. So let us know, trainerroad.com/jobs, and some interesting stuff that we've posted up, some helpful stuff just recently on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/trainerroad. Tucker put together kind of like a mashup, so to speak, of Nate, your finishes. We talked about this last week, but from going from Cat 5 to Cat 2 in a year. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's I love YouTube comments. Thanks, everyone. One thing they keep saying, a lot of people who I don't think listen to the podcast, is that I have like all this natural talent.
Yeah, I saw that.
Chad, look at Chad. I was like, Tucker, you got to put it on
Chad
live because Chad's seen me my whole like cycling career pretty much. When I used to do indoor power, I think my first test with you was like 2:26. Yeah, and I was like, I think that was my 20-minute average power with you.
It wasn't terribly impressive.
And then you took a few years off of training
for the Olympics.
Gained a lot of weight.
You were behind, or you were under 200.
Yeah, it was like 189.
And
so after when I did 226 with Chad, that was when I was like in full training to my best ability. I didn't have a power meter. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just like, put in some miles.
Yeah.
I hired a coach. He's like, ride for 3 hours. I was like, okay. And that killed me.
Yeah. So,
but I got destroyed a lot from all y'all.
Yeah.
For many
I remember
years.
those days. Yeah.
It's kind of fun. Yeah, it is fun. It's an interesting thing because on this podcast, I feel like, Nate, you're very open with sharing your learning process. So as a result, I think a lot of people think that because we as humans are very good at thinking that we never screw up, but everybody else around us screws up, right? So when people hear that, they think, Nate screws up all the time. I never screw up. I think that's kind of like what's going on here because people have this perception that you're not as good as you are, whether it's tactics or whether it's anything else like that. So, and I snickered quite a lot when I read because there were quite a few comments about how I'd move from 5 to 2 in a year if I had crazy natural talent or ability, something like that. And I was like, man,
it's a lot of training.
It's a
Follow
lot
me on
of
Strava.
hard work.
A lot of training,
Nate
a lot of
Pearson.
racing. You do a lot of racing too.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly. And the one thing I do in my power profile, the thing I'm really good at is 1 minute power compared to my other power profile. But I have to get my whole power profile up in order to do that. If that makes sense.
The other thing that you've had over this year, but the cool part is everybody can use this for sure, is Pete constantly critiquing your performances and you being critical about your performances because it's not just enough to have somebody else be critical, but you have to be willing to be critical, right? I mean, I'm sure you saw the Amber in your career.
Yeah.
Amber's doing it next time.
Yeah,
she's joining the team. And two, everyone, if you listen, I get no extra, we don't sit down with my footage extra and be like, okay, Nate, here are the real tips.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is the extent. Everything you hear is everything I hear too.
Yeah. Although at some point that may be a good strategy to do, to give people definitely don't be the first into the last turn. Don't do that. Just to help you out, right?
We do talk ahead of time. I get Pete, and actually, I think we already said this, but Amber looked through the footage and she's like, I won that race, I won that race, I won that race. She's like, oh yeah, I won that race. But I will get hints ahead of time from you and Pete about how to go into the finish.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So you can check out that video. It's condensed learnings that we got from that. It's not covering every race. It's just the finish of those races. And I think it's a cool thing to be able to, then you can link out and you can check out all the other videos too, which is really handy to have. So you can check that out. And that's all in our race analysis series. You can subscribe to that playlist. So then you'll get notified when we post new videos that are race analysis videos. And we post a video basically every weekday as we go throughout. Just short clips from this podcast or something else along those lines to help you get faster. And then on our blog, we just posted a new training article. Megan Kelly, one of our copywriters here, an awesome writer herself, she wrote about how to improve your sweet spot workouts because that's a very big thing that we see with a lot of people once they dive into sweet spot training. And she covered everything from the nutrition side of things, the psychological, and actually the physical things, what's going on with your body.
She really nailed it.
Stuff.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yep. Really good one. So check that out. In fact, as soon as she posted that, like the feedback instantly when people were like, oh, this is so great. I was wondering why it felt so hard. And that's, the answer lies within. So with that, let's get into Jorge's question. He's actually one thing first. Amber, you brought something up, and it's funny because I saw a tweet from influential figure within the cycling space. I guess we'll just call the person. We'll keep it anonymous. But
was it me? Just kidding.
Influential, no doubt.
Said influential.
Yeah.
Oh.
But
set you up for that.
Softball. Yeah. But I saw a tweet that said something along the lines of like, somebody is telling, or a cyclist was telling me that, it's the holidays, I always gain 10 pounds. And the tweet said something like, it's only 3 meals, get a hold of yourself. It was like very
Wow.
tough. And like, I understand. And I think we all understand that like self-loathing to a certain degree can be helpful. It can be extremely damaging. It's tough to be able to balance that. But we were talking about this the other day about because it's the time of year and like, managing that, because a lot of people, we see them stressing out and they're like, I need to train because I'm going to eat later and we're going to have a big Christmas feast and I need to train or else I can't eat it. And it's just causes a huge amount of stress.
Right. And this time of year, I think for many people is really stressful for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with training.
Yeah.
But I think a really good rule of thumb, somebody said this to me a long time ago, and you can swap in whatever holidays you want, but what you do between New Year's and Christmas is really what matters, and it matters a whole lot more than what you do between Christmas and New Year's. So, and this is the time of year you start hearing a lot of people talking about earning calories, and I think it's important to just step back and be a little bit mindful about how that might be damaging for people who are hearing you say that, and it might also be damaging for the person who's saying that. And just quick reality check. Our bodies are pretty rad at keeping us alive.
Yeah.
And maybe just based on that are deserving of some nourishment. And I also think that we're all deserving a little bit of some compassion. So showing compassion for ourselves. And this is a stressful time of year. So if you're training in your nutrition, get off track a little bit, it's okay. Just get back on track when you can. And I think that we just need to accept that it's probably going to happen. We're all going to go off track at some point. Even the pros do. Let me just tell you that. And instead of spending the next week or 2 weeks just torturing yourself with internal self-abuse, which, let's be honest, some of our internal monologues are
Pretty harsh.
It's pretty abusive.
I think about that at times when I'm on the bike. I'm like, wow, if this is ever externalized, like, gosh, this would be bad.
Yeah. And we do it all the time to ourselves. So, take that part out of it. So you screw up once, you get off track, you make a mistake. It's okay. You're not going to end your season over the next week.
And it's also how you frame it. Because I go into some of these things and thinking, hey, you get as much as you can. This is a good thing because if you do it now, you'll have less like cravings later on during the season or during different parts. For instance, a little story for Chad Timmerman. During my recovery week, I did go to Popeyes and have the new Popeye sandwich. Should I tell this story yet?
No, you haven't.
Okay.
It's not on
I
the
saw evidence
podcast.
of it, though,
So
yeah.
I went to it. How did you see the
It's
evidence?
on Slack.
Okay, just talk. As soon as I was like, what?
He was speaking through Chad's monitor.
So we went there.
Check.
My daughter wanted to try it too. She ordered the sandwich. They got her sandwich wrong. So I suddenly had two sandwiches.
What's it do?
And then, I thought, I'm not going to do this all the time. I might as well get all the Popeyes chicken sandwich I could. So I ate that too. And then she didn't finish her sandwich. So we're out on a third sandwich. And I did 2.5. I felt self-loathing. But I was also like, you know what? I've scratched that itch. I don't want one of these for the rest of my life. If you do it too much, it happened to train at a party. I had some wine, and then I had a little more wine. Then I had a vodka soda, and then it all came up. Now I really don't want any of that for a lot of time. I'm not saying you should throw up, but just the idea, I was like, I'm going to do it all the way, meet all the cookies, and then back on track.
Yeah, you can't always walk that straight and narrow line. And if
Well,
you
we're
try
not
to,
pros
you're setting
too,
yourself up for
and
failure.
even pros don't do it.
No, they don't. I mean, I think honestly, just taking the time to really enjoy yourself, and instead of, okay, I'm going to have a cookie and I'm going to just flog myself for it, versus have that cookie, really just enjoy the heck out of it.
Maybe have a couple.
And then,
Go crazy.
have more than, I mean,
Really, as many as fit in
Really,
your hands,
like,
I think is a fair rule.
We could have a
Relax
competition.
a little bit.
That's definitely not. Because I know who would win that.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, Nate would win for sure. I think it's a really important thing to remember. I know like a lot of my friends, which really quick side note, the whole Rafa Festive 500 thing, you know, that happens like right now, people are trying to fit in 500 Ks until the new year. And like I see, which by the way, Australians, you're totally cheating. Like I see you guys talking, like making it super dramatic, and it's like beautiful outside. But you know, that it's like a time where I see a lot of like, it's like you said, I think it's a really emotional time. So we try to manage things in we do things in irregular ways, like in this time period, I find like, and we don't. And so, yeah, it's definitely like, be mindful about it. Listen to Amber.
Food's a
It's
pretty
fantastic.
reliable source of comfort too. And if you deprive yourself of the comfort that comes with it by punishing yourself for it or chastising yourself for it, it's a pretty vicious cycle.
Especially seasonal foods that many people had like during their childhood.
Yeah.
Right? They're like extra comforting.
Sure.
And you're like,
Nostalgia.
and
Yeah.
you're like, oh, I can't touch it now.
Yeah. And there's absolutely something you said, or something to what you said about like depriving yourself of something and then that wearing you thin over time. And that rather, you know,
Yeah. Just remember, the season's long.
Yes.
It's a
And
long.
it can't all be hard work.
Oh yeah, 100%. Jorge's question. He says, "My name is Jorge, and I'm from Argentina, but living in Toronto. First of all, thanks for the great podcast. It's been my commute partner for about 2 years, and you guys make me forget about the horrible traffic of Toronto. Now here's my case. As a good Argentine, my main sport was always football. You know, you guys call it soccer. Yeah, of course. Yes. He says, I'll be 50 next January and still playing regularly, although my league season ended last September. That's something consistent with what I found when I was living in Latin America. It's amazing how, like, you know, old men, they're like 65 and they have like every Tuesday they have their soccer team thing and they all meet up and play soccer, which is pretty cool.
65 that old, but
What's that? Well,
whatever.
well, you know, it's older than what you usually see playing soccer. It's super impressive. So anticipating that, and the reason that that's an important tip is that's not an easy thing to do, to be playing soccer. That's a super physical activity in general.
Point
right?
taken. Yeah.
I started cycling around 2 years ago as a way to improve my fitness during the football offseason. I got hooked with the sport, ironically, after reading Tyler Hamilton's book. And although I don't compete or follow a structured training plan, I've seen great improvement in fitness and, in addition, dropped 10 kilograms in those 2 years. During 2019, I also returned to running, this time applying lots of things that I've learned from cycling and training with purpose for every workout, something that I've never done before. I did three local races ranging from a 10K to a half marathon, and as I've never trained with method, regularity, or this intensity, it's safe to say that I'm in my best shape after the last 20 years. How sweet is that? That's cool. Like, get to 50 years old and you're in the best shape of your life. Yeah, it's awesome. So it says, for 2020, I've already signed up for the Toronto Marathon in May. I bet a lot of people are like, why are we reading this question? He's talking about running, but you'll see. It says, currently I'm running 3 times a week, combining long runs and intervals, and I think I can run a half without notice, meaning like right off the couch. So with 5 months of training, I think the marathon is doable. So far, so good. The bad news is that I have a good and annoying friend of mine who is 10 years younger than me and who completed 2 half Ironmans and is pushing me to do one in late September 2020, which would give me about 4 months to train after the marathon. So my question would be, if I don't have the time to complete the half plan, which part of the plan would you cut? The base part, since I'll be cultivating my aerobic base for the marathon, or the specialty phase and show up with whatever fitness I can reach for the event. For the record, my only goal for the 70.3 would be just to finish it. He says, I guess the point that I would like to clarify is if the base from the run translates to the bike, and there are some aspects of the bike that need to be addressed from scratch. And then he says one more question. And the last one is just curiosity. What do you think is more difficult, the marathon or the 70.3? I'd appreciate any insight and keep up the good work. Nate, you want to jump
I'm the
on
only
that
one who's done both of those.
It's true.
Right?
Yeah.
Marathon. Yep.
Yeah.
To me, it goes half Ironman, marathon, Ironman for difficulty.
Sure.
Cool.
If you can do a marathon, half's not bad. Even though it takes longer, it's not as bad as marathon by sure.
How does my 5K rank in there?
That's the easiest,
Good to know. Okay. I consider myself a running expert
but the
there.
most painful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, sprint triathlon too. 5K is probably the most painful though.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's all going to hurt. With that, one other point that he makes really quickly, and we'll answer this question, and then we'll get into really the answering the meat of it. But he says, I guess the point that he'd like to clarify is if the base from the run translates to the bike. We've talked about this before, Chad, about like running fitness translating over to the bike translating to the run.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, yes, there is some crossover.
Some systemic.
Right.
I mean, your cardiovascular system is intact and firing on most cylinders, but the the type of muscle stress, even the joint actions, which look really similar, are quite a bit different. There's no eccentric loading on a bike. There's plenty of that on a run. They're two different animals for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's how that translates. Now, his question about how to follow the plan and how to truncate it or how to extend it, whatever else, that is, I have all the questions categorized from the podcast. We get hundreds every week, and that is the most common sort of question that we get. Yeah. And this is one of the big reasons why we built Plan Builder. And we'll actually, producer Tucker will pull up Plan Builder now. So if you're joining us on YouTube, you'll be able to see how it all works. So we actually just built off this scenario more or less. Where you'll be able to see my account here, but we built off this scenario more or less, so then people can see it. So first things first, he basically is going to have 4 months of training for a half Ironman, and he's going to have very minimal training, if any, on a bike, and because he's just training for the marathon, and then he's going to go into that, right? We'll step through. So I guess the first thing that you do when you go through Plan Builder is you select how much you've trained recently, which in this case, Tucker, yeah, there we go. Let's just go for the 0 to 3, 4 to 5. Let's say that. There we go. So, and then that basically gets you to a point. It says, how much have you trained recently? Gets you to a point where you select, or actually it recommends the training volume you should follow. Go ahead and click the low volume because that's what it recommended in this case. Then after that, it asks you your experience level with interval training. And in this case, Jorge is probably around the intermediate level based on what he said. So Tucker will select that. And then Tucker will go all the way forward to May 31st, 2021, because we don't want to mess up my current plan. So that'll be the start date because that'll give him about 4 months to a late September one, which in this case, if you go ahead and click next, it'll ask you if you want to add existing events that already exist on your calendar. And yeah, let's go ahead and use that one. In this case, I just put in Ironman 70.3 Cozumel. So you can see that on the screen now. And then go ahead and in this case, you can do things like add openers for your A and B events, which is really cool. And then if you have a ton of races, this is where you'd see them. Then hit next. If you're listening to the podcast, this is why you should watch, by the way. And then it lays out your plan. You can drag around the days to train on Monday or Tuesday. You can change your run, swim, and bike, whatever else you want to change the whole schedule. You can do that.
Ooh, make Sunday outside, Tucker.
Oh, yeah. You can also click on inside or outside. So you just click on whatever workout. It's pretty neat. And then right there, all of your Sundays, let's say, are all going to be outside from there on. And that'll just push directly to your Garmin or your Wahoo, which is pretty sweet. And then go ahead and click Review Plan, Tucker. At this point, it gives you a whole breakdown of what you'll do for training. And you can rename your plan. So you could name it like IM 70.3 Cozumel, for example, whatever else you wanted to name it, which is handy to have if you have multiple things that you're training for and building for. And then it basically gives you this. So Jorge, in this case, Plan Builder recommends that you do 8 weeks or a full base phase, and we'll get into the why in just a bit here, and 5 weeks, which would be, or 5 weeks of build, so that's truncated, that's shortened up, and then 4 weeks of your specialty, which that's shortened as well, because they'd usually be 8 weeks each one of those phases if you just had the perfect amount of time. Then you go into your race, and then it gives you a recovery week after that. So chances are the reason that it does this is because since you're a newer rider, it wants to emphasize the base phase, right, Chad?
Yeah, exactly. And he came in with relatively low training volume to start with. Mm-hmm. And he wants to train in a low manner fashion too. So we're definitely going to. Yeah.
And like we talked about, even though he may have some, like the aerobic system's firing, he has a lot of, in terms of the training volume for the muscular training volume that he's been doing for riding a bike is very low.
And it's a long, steady state race too. Mm-hmm. So base fitness is crucial.
Yep.
Base forms of fitness.
Exactly. So in this case, since he had less experience, that's why it's trying to emphasize the base phase and it's truncating the rest and it's going to bring you in. But the cool part is whatever your scenario is, Plan Builder considers all of those things and builds it out. So that if you have a question like that, it's not that we don't want you to send in the questions. Please continue to do that. That's totally fine. But hopefully this can help you get a plan and everything else you need. It's fun to even play around with. So pretty cool stuff. We've just basically just like coded Chad's brain. So hooked up some electrodes, and next thing you know, it all worked. So
that's what we did.
It's just how it works.
Very scientific.
That's it. Now let's go into the next question from Todd. It says, longtime Trainer Road user and podcast listener. First off, thank you, you guys and gals in this case, right? Keep raising the bar in terms of what you offer and somehow manage to keep the podcast both informative and entertaining. I'm a triathlete mostly focusing on 70.3 and full distance races. Last year during this time period, so preseason, I focused on my weakness, which is what we've actually told. Big question, focus on weaknesses or strengths. And in the off season, it's a good chance to focus on your weakness. right? Once you're in the season, focus on your strength and work on that. So it says, I focus on my weakness, which is short sprint power, and that worked really well. I have a much lower training load and don't want to get too specific too early in my training. Endurance is usually not an issue for me, but my top end power is pretty lousy. So my question is, do I decrease the effectiveness of a sprint workout if I follow it by an hour of easy endurance riding? For example, if I did an hour workout such as Fuji, which is basically, which Tucker is bringing that up right now so you can see it on the screen. But breaking it down to show you what it really is it's 20-second hard starts basically to these intervals.
Yeah.
And then from there, it basically goes into...
Well, they're 20-second sprints, really.
Right.
Yeah, not hard starts because you're settling into recovery afterward.
Yep. And then the intensity thereafter is at 65%, and you do that for 3 minutes. And then there's a whole batch of those guys that you have to deal with. Mm-hmm. So that's what that workout is. He says, if I did that and they did an extra hour of riding at 60 to 70% after that workout, would I be limiting my ability to adapt to the sprint work? Similarly, if I do a strength session in the gym and follow it by 30 minutes of vigorous walking, still in zone 2, do I limit my adaptations to the strength work? I usually do these workouts with just a serving of protein before and hold off on any carbs until I'm done. If I were to fuel right after the sprint session, work with a balance of carbs and protein, would that be useful to help start recovery during my easy endurance and limit any negative effects of the endurance work on my sprint work? So there's a number of different questions in here. Chad, which one do you want to tackle first, or how do you want to go about answering this one?
Talk about how the sprint workout impacts endurance.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yeah, so with those, I mean, in particular, they're loaded into the base phase of the triathlon plans. And, we've gotten this question from probably every triathlete who's looked at that plan. Why do I need to do sprint work? They're not strictly sprint work. I mean, they are sprint intensity, but we're not trying to improve a triathlon sprint. Mm-hmm. It's not the intention, not at all. All we're really looking for is to simply increase pedaling power. Mm-hmm. So there are things that come with that. For instance, we've talked about time to recruitment before, how quickly you can recruit the fibers. And if you look at it in terms of the Army metaphor I've used in the past, is really how quickly you can rally the troops and direct them at a single objective, right? Mm-hmm. Get everyone ready to roll and aimed at the same task. And though it's not really a focus here, there is some benefit to be derived from this time to recruitment enhancement or occurrence. And then there's motor pattern training. So again, to the Army analogy, it's how well you can rally and direct the troops. So, face them at one thing and do it properly. And there's different components of that. So there's a practice component where we really want to ingrain proper habits, emphasis on proper. We're not just looking to spin the pedals faster or whatever. We're looking to do it exceptionally well. There's a fatigue component. We want to be able to reproduce these proper habits in a fatigue state. And that's particularly relevant with endurance athletes and steady state athletes too, especially actually. Then there's an educational component. So it's an opportunity for you to learn, how often can I do an effort that's this hard? Just how hard can I do a 20-second effort and expect to be able to repeat it with some consistency? Doesn't really apply to triathlon training. It's more of a mass start sort of application, but it's still a potential learning effort, not that you'll apply it in a triathlon. There's some anaerobic capacity benefit to be derived. And again, it's not really what we're after, but improvements in anaerobic capacity can influence FTP. I mean, FTP has a large anaerobic component, so it just means you have to fuel differently to exploit it, but it's there and it's usable and it's beneficial. And then, we do want to increase bike-specific leg strength. So this is as close as we're going to get to strength training on a bicycle. It's one of the ways of going about it. And then, so if you think about it, if I can do these 20-second repeats at 500 watts, probably stands to reason I could do 20 10-second repeats at that 500 watts. So then if you lift that, or even 5 30-second repeats at maybe 400 watts, drop it down a bit and extend the duration. So if you lift that 20-second power to say from 500 to 600, now it's realistic to think that you can do a bunch of 10-second repeats at 600 watts, a bunch of 30-second repeats down at 500 watts, which used to be your 20-second power. So these are all useful things. And again, may not directly apply them on a triathlon course, but working at a percentage of this new higher ceiling.
Well, I think it might apply. I mean, if you have any corners on the course.
That's true.
And you need to accelerate out of the corner and get up to speed because you're chasing speed there. And then punchy climbs.
For sure, punchy climbs. And then we're not even factoring in that some of these races could be draft legal, in which case you're definitely going to rely on this
then
stuff.
This is going to be really important to make selections.
Yep.
And part of me too, just because I'm so used to cycling and how like cutthroat it is, even in like full distance and half distance when I'm watching it on the internet and everything else, and I see somebody making a pass, right? They basically enter into the drafting zone and then they make a pass.
Passes.
Everyone's
That's
so
another good
kind to
case.
each other, like relatively speaking, it seems like I can't help but feel like if somebody was making a pass on me, I'd be like, okay, I'm just going to pick it up a little bit. You know, like
That's
make
illegal.
you work a little harder.
And triathletes are nice.
I know, exactly,
But
right? They're
typically,
not
how long-
roadies.
Hey, cyclists are nice too.
Some of them, yeah. How long would a pass take on like a half distance or to get around? I mean, it depends on how many riders you're going to get around. But let's say you just have to get around a couple
So
riders.
normally it's not like the Kona coverage where it's everyone's in a line, you're doing this stuff. For everyone else, there's usually waves, or when you're passing people, it's like you're going, it's like when you pass people on the road, right? Who's riding? There's like a 3 or 4 mile per hour speed differential, and you're just going. You don't even like think of it. Like you could, and then 2, you can come up in their draft, so it's way easy. Age groupers, you can go in your draft and just come out and come around. Even like when we do a TT, right? It just happens.
Sure.
So you're more focused on just your solid power.
Yeah.
And in a race, I don't think I actually try to never spike up. Even I don't think triathlons really have turn. I think I've done a couple with turnarounds. I haven't never done a big one with turnarounds. I guess Kona has a turnaround. That's a pretty big one.
And
but
it's an
even
uphill
with
one.
that too, people aren't usually sprinting out of
Sure.
it. They're just coming back up to speed, thinking about the run.
Yeah.
Yeah, but part of me, the cyclist, always thinks like, "Oh man," I'd be like, because it's weird how cutthroat we are, us road cyclists. So yeah,
Jonathan.
Sorry,
And by we,
sorry, that's weird how
just assumes
cutthroat I
everyone
am.
else
Nothing wrong with being competitive.
It's weird how
Nothing
cutthroat I
wrong
am.
with
I
it.
apologize. So it's probably, even though there isn't like some practical application in terms of them always using this out on the course, it does occur from 1 second to the next.
Yeah.
But the main goal isn't necessarily to prepare you for that sprint or anything
sprinting, not
else.
necessarily. No, it's all the types of fitness that come with sprint training.
Correct. Yeah.
And this isn't legit sprint training, and I'll get to that in a second too. And then, of course, there's the benefit to aerobic capacity, and that's really what we're after with this. And it's really what we're after with just about every workout in the catalog. So if this were a sprint capacity workout and we were just looking to elevate someone's sprint power, their 10-second, 12-second power, that's what we do. 10 and 12-second efforts. They'd be all-out efforts where you empty the tank, regardless of how short it is, whether it's 8 seconds or 15 seconds. Everything you've got to just barely last that duration. And then the recoveries would be long. We're talking like 8-10 minutes. So legit long. So that you can do that again and reproduce it. And as soon as you can't reproduce it within a pretty narrow margin, that's it. The workout's over.
Yeah.
That's not what we're doing here. We're doing these at about 200%. We're doing a heck of a lot of them, and there's not a lot of recovery. It seems like 4 minutes, that's a ton of recovery in between efforts. It's not. It's not. When you look at, you're going, in the case of, I think we're talking about Fuji, that's 9 efforts.
That's
And then
a
the
lot.
progression from that is Mount Tai, which is 10 efforts. I mean, fatigue does happen well before 10, and you still have to gut it out, conjure that 200 watts, do it again on not enough
200%,
recovery,
yeah.
or 200%, do it again on not a lot of recovery. And this makes it, I mean, those anaerobic fibers are fatiguing, so the aerobic load, the aerobic, or the attention garnered or given to the aerobic system just grows and grows and grows and grows. So this is, again, I mean, the focus here is on aerobic power and aerobic adaptation. All those other things may come with it, and they're nice side benefits, but they're not the intention.
Right. Like a true sprint athlete who's maybe doing training for sprints on the track, for example, over the course of a 1.5 to 2 hour workout, they may only do 3 or 4 efforts.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, but
they are
intense
legit
focus.
efforts.
Yeah.
They're
Full
efforts.
out. Right. And
Yeah.
contrast that with 9 efforts within a workout. It's a very different beast.
Very different. And within
Yeah.
an hour workout.
Yeah.
And we're packing it in there.
So
Yeah.
clearly different objectives than
Right.
just a sprint workout.
Yeah, it's still an aerobic workout. It may not look like it, and the efforts may not be strictly aerobic, but the benefits we're looking for are aerobic.
Yep. Absolutely.
Largely.
Cool.
So with all that in mind, the goals of these workouts are many, as I just illustrated, but they don't include sprint capacity. If you do want to address sprint capacity, you'd be better off looking at workouts like Burling or Detling, maybe Charing, because even Charing pushes up to 6 sprints, and that's when we're starting to cram kind of a lot of work in a single hour. And in those cases, I'd probably drop those into the workout creator and modify them, make those recoveries longer, or just pause the workout for an extra 4 or 5 minutes between each of those sprints. That's assuming you want to make it a true sprint workout. And if sprint capacity were the concern, if you are trying to, even as a triathlete, maybe you race other types of races, if you are trying to improve your sprint capacity and you want to emphasize those sprints, then do it just like you're doing it. Front load the workout with your sprint so the quality's high, so there's no real fatigue creeping into the system. so you can fully exploit your sprint power. If end of the race power generation is a concern, you need to have a strong finish, then backload the workout, put the sprints at the end, see what you can conjure when you've got an hour's worth of fatigue in your leg or longer. And then, of course, if in mass start situations, you sprinkle throughout, use them liberally, because as we all know, as mass start racers, you sprint a lot. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes they're full gas right in the midst of a race, or even the start of a race.
Start of a race.
Yeah.
It happened a few times to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've made that ill-fated move.
So, but in this case, it may seem, and even maybe not in the case of sprint workouts, but it seems like they're conflicting cell signals, right? I'm asking for strength on the one hand, but I'm an endurance athlete. No, this is still an endurance workout, and these are still endurance efforts.
Got it. So like what we were talking about last week of cell signaling and everything else going through that whole process, or maybe it was that the week before. Jeez, I don't know. I apologize.
Week before,
but talking about that, this is a situation where we're kind of pulling on the same strings. We're not necessarily crossing.
Yeah, you're not in the gym with a big squat bar on your back, moving at a really slow rate and doing 5 to 10 reps and calling it good. I mean, we're doing hundreds of revolutions in a minute, potentially 100 revolutions in a minute, more if you're sprinting quickly. So
imagine doing 100 squats in a minute. It'd be pretty crazy.
Well,
doesn't happen.
There wouldn't be much weight on the bar, I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly.
And it'd be very much endurance.
Yes.
So this led us down the path of asking ourselves, with this cross signaling between strength messaging and endurance messaging, where's the cutoff? Where do we know when one is negatively influencing the other? Mm-hmm. We don't know, and I don't know that that's known. These are downstream effects. I mean, you look at how you train, and then you look weeks, even months down the road, and see how that training impacts performance. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if it's something you can really see in real time. When we talk often about the AMPK or AMPK signaling and the mTOR signaling, it's really, if you want to simplify it tremendously, it's just, will the body eat or grow itself? I mean, those are the two messages, and you can see how those would conflict with each other.
Catabolic versus anabolic.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So as far as measuring that stuff, I honestly don't know. I'm going to guess it's muscle biopsy, in which case it's not like real-time feedback. It's not something you're going to ever be able to measure what's termed in situ, in location, real time, like with a continuous blood glucose monitor.
Right.
I don't think we're ever going to have that technology to tell us when we have conflicting signals between endurance adaptation and strength adaptation.
Yeah.
There might be correlates. There might be surrogate markers that can be used, like we use blood lactate to tell us about our blood pH, that sort of thing. But when one signal overrides the other, when exactly that happens, I don't know how we're ever going to figure something like that out.
Because
that's never going to be practical.
Because that's kind of the root. Like in this case, getting back to like Todd's like main question here that we have, of like his question of like, will the endurance afterward adversely affect the sprint work? That's what we're really talking about. That cross signaling. That's this is kind of the crux of that question.
Exactly. So ostensibly, these look like strength workouts, but again, it's still aerobic work, and really it if you look at it in terms of just the force necessary to even turn over at 200% FTP, that's nowhere near what it takes to push up 200 pounds loaded on your back. It's a very different rate of contraction, very different amount of force being doled out. So it's not the same thing. So really, this add-on endurance that he's tacking on to the end of an already aerobic workout is just complementary aerobic work.
Yeah.
It's just furthering the aerobic
There's
request.
money in the bank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
It's it definitely brings to light the I guess the dissonance or the lack of understanding that I've had and that I commonly see too with a lot of athletes, in the sense that they think when I see something way above that white line of threshold, that
how can this possibly be applicable to what I'm trying to achieve?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the fact is, it's not quite when you look at it with the example of strength training over here, it really starts to show you the fact that they do differ quite a lot.
Think in terms of downstream effects. What's happening right now during this workout is a very different demand than what I'm going to face on the race course, but it's going to impart benefits later on that will make me a faster, steady state rider.
What I think about is how hard I'm breathing. So if you do like a sprint, that's like it's aerobically driven, and you just a long one. Afterwards, you're like, Then go in the gym and do like 3 squats. You're like, not breathing hard.
Yeah,
like, that was hard.
But
You
it's
might be
really
shaking.
hard. Yeah,
it might be
exactly.
shaking. You might breathe a little bit, but and especially if you hold your breath. But other strength training stuff, you go through it, it's like you're not breathing that hard, and then you're breathing like you want to die. Like it gives you a sense of which one's aerobic and which one's not.
Exactly. Big aerobic stimulus. I mean, if you're gasping for air, safe to say you've challenged your aerobic system.
Yep. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Good. That's thanks for the breakdown, Chad.
Hey,
Yeah.
you're welcome.
Put everything in
my job.
perspective. That's it. Andre's question says, hey guys, love your podcast. I always pick up great tips that'll make me faster. I'm a Cat 5 coming up on my first race season. I'm planning to do mostly crits. My question is, what do you guys have on display, and gals in this case, on your Garmin's or Wahoos while you race? Do you have different setups for different kinds of races? I'd love to hear from all of you, and especially Critmaster Pete. So Pete's actually going to chime in on the forum on this one. So if you go in and you search for this episode 238, you'll be able to see what Pete has and everything else. But I figure it's a good opportunity for all of us to share what we've done here.
Critmaster Amber.
Critmaster Amber. Amber, what do you have on crits, and then does it change for different races?
Yeah, for me in racing, I really like to keep it simple, and everybody's different, so you need to figure out what's going to work for you. But when I'm training, I like to focus on specific things. So I'll be training my VO2, I'll be training, my sweet spot. So I'll be training different systems that prepare me to be able to have those tools at the ready when I'm racing. But when I'm racing, I really want to be focused on the race. So for me personally, I don't want to look at my power numbers because I don't want to be thinking about, oh boy, I don't want to limit myself if I think that I've gone too hard too many times. I want to be present in the race and focus on what's happening in the moment in the race. So for crits, I will only have time on my display. And the only reason that I have time on the display is to help me fuel. So I try to have fuel incoming at least every 30 minutes during road races. During crits, I try to get at least one gel in. Sometimes it's a little bit harder because it can be technical and intense, but also from a tactical standpoint, having an idea of, if it breaks up the road, having that timer on my display can help me calculate what the time gap might be. So the timing can actually help with tactics, and sometimes I'll try to wait to really start making my moves until the second half of the race. So having that timer to see when we hit that point can help. But in road races, I'll add distance. So in road races, I'll only have time and distance. So during the road race, I'll use the time mostly for fueling. And then the distance, I'm kind of a stickler about studying courses, and I highly recommend this. So if you're going to do a road race, even a crit, take a look at the course and figure out what points on that course are going to be selective. So it might be a climb, it could be a technical section, it could even be a descent if you think it's going to be a tough one to navigate in a group. And then what I'll do is I'll just have a mental note of at what distance points in the race those selections are. So if I know there's a technical section coming up, I'll use the distance to say, okay, I've got 5K to get in position for that technical section. And then it sets you up for success in each of those selection points. And then I'll also add stem tape. If for some of the longer races that I used to do in Europe, if you didn't have a chance to see the course, so you didn't have visual markers, I have a stem tape that would say, I have a little triangle symbol for a climb, and then at that distance, that's when the climb starts. And so I'll be able to gauge the distance versus the stem tape notes and know when I need to get into position. And that just helps you use your energy a little bit more efficiently during the race. So yeah, I try to keep it really simple.
Cool. We've covered this quite some time ago. Has anything changed?
I think so.
Because you've raced. I mean, you've gone through a ton of racing since we talked about this last
time. I also do normalized power, and I like that. It's more vanity, or not vanity. Actually, in the middle of the race, I probably am limiting myself, but I think we've done some local races where the first 3 or 4 minutes is 420, and I'm like, this is too much.
Yeah,
chill
and the
out.
Power because it's hard. Because in that moment, you don't know. You may be feeling very capable, or just you may feel like you're blowing up. But the number can be a good check, right? To say okay, this is as hard as it feels, or this isn't as hard as it feels.
I do Garmin. It's either 3 or 5 second power, and I've used that a lot in breakaways where I get so. We're gonna cover this in one of my Masters 1, 2, 3 races where I blew myself up. But I will, when I pull, I'll just I'll be so excited to be in the breakaway, and I'll pull way too hard. So to kind of back myself out. And also if I'm in a breakaway, if I'm breaking away by myself, like you in our road race, trying to meter my efforts for a long time, because I'll go too hard, and because at the beginning it feels easy.
Oh yeah.
And then it feels hard, and then at the end I have to actually push harder. Speed, I also like that for breakaways, because sometimes it's hard for me to tell in the race how fast we're actually going. But I'll look at a section, say we're going 27, I'm like, okay, that's fast enough to stay away, and then we start going 23. That will change my pacing strategy and how hard I should pull, because I think we're going to come back. And then for road races, I do distance. One tip, if you watch the videos and you trip the volume for my full race, there's so often do I say, hey, how long is this race? Or I say, especially for crits, I'm like, what's the time? Because sometimes I'll do 2 or 3 crits in a day, and each crit will be different time.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
It's hard to
And-
keep track of it.
Yeah.
all.
And
Especially when
luckily,
you're foggy brained.
some people I know lie to me because if they're like, I'm like, that's way too long. It's not 2 hours, but yeah.
They're just ready to give
Sometimes-
misinformation. It's
Well,
their
40
tactic.
versus 45 minutes, I'm like, what is it? And then, so when I will attack and stuff like that. So really know, this is a dumb pro tip, but know how long your race is before you
Yeah,
start.
it's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chad?
I differentiate between whether I'm racing or training. And as far as racing, time's always on there regardless. Most of the time, distance is on there, kind of like Amber mentioned and Nate just now. Road races, time trials, where distance is a super big component. Not so much with crits and cross. Who cares how far the course is? I mean, it's time. You're looking at
Yeah.
time
Yep.
and laps. And then 3-second power. I have it on there all the time. Doesn't mean I look at it, but just like Nate showed us, I mean, there are times where you need to look down. I don't want to be switching screens because now I want to check my power. So I put it on the bottom. It's there if I ever need to rely on it, and it's useful in a lot of instances.
That's true.
I don't let it rein me in necessarily, although there are instances where I have. And then with training, as much data as I can get on the screen. Just because you're out training, there's a lot of things to take in. I want to know what the grade is. I want to know what the temperature is. I want to know how much climbing I've done so far. I mean, why not?
Sure.
I'm training.
Have it all.
It's just
Chad has a book that has textbooks.
Yes,
Like
he
text in there.
yeah, I
That's
really
his
does.
second training screen.
just for easy rides.
So for mountain bike, so I have different for mountain biking, for road, for TTs. And so for TTs, I just put normalized. Well, actually, I have an overarching thing for all of my views on my Garmin. I always use a lap view for everything. So like everything is lap, elapsed time, or lap whatever else, lap power, lap normal, that sort of thing. So and I do that usually because I don't want to deal with the struggle of going to the line, ending my because I'll probably record for a bit during my warm up, and then like ending that, and then having to go through the process of hoping that the Garmin just stops it all, and then in time I can hit start before I go.
Uploads and resets.
Extra stress. I don't need it. I could just hit the lap button, and then it's fine, right? So I view a lap view while I race all the time. With that being said, for time trials, I only have, and this is, people are probably going to think I'm silly. And once again, I'm not like some crazy good time trialist, so I might be very wrong. But for me, what I like to have is just normalized power and then my 5-second power. That's it. I don't want to see time. I don't want to see distance. I don't want to see anything like that.
Wow.
Because when I look at the course and study the course beforehand, like you said,
Yeah.
I'll know and I'll do the homework to know what I should be able to maintain on that course in terms of power. And I just want to stick to power. That's it for a TT.
That's hardcore. No time.
Yeah,
That's it. I don't care
I'm
because
not ever doing that.
the hard thing for me with time is I'll see that and there are plenty of times where I'll be a quarter of the way into a time trial or a halfway in, and I see the time and I'll freak out because of the time, and I'll throw my pacing
Understandable.
plan out the window.
Yeah.
And if I just stick to my pacing plan, and the one thing is like you mentioned that like power can like hold you back. I feel like I've never once had a situation where my power meter has been holding me back.
And you backed off. Yeah.
It's always that like I need to work harder to hit my power goal, right? Like for if I've done my homework and laid out a good power goal.
Even in the first minute.
No,
I've
I
seen-
don't
yeah.
look at anything in the first minute.
Well,
I just try to stay.
Maybe you should.
Hey, now I've done good ones and I've done bad ones. So, but no, I try not to. So that's time trialing for me. But when I get into road racing, it's different. So if I'm doing a road race, I'm going to throw distance on, but that's the only thing that I'll basically change. I'll just have elapsed time. I'll have normalized power, and then I'll have my my 3-second power is usually what I think I have on there. And then with mountain biking, I don't throw distance on there. I don't have time either. I guess I can't think of the only way that I would do time is during a short track event. But otherwise, they're never time based. They're always lap based, and feed zones are very clear in where they are, unless you're doing some sort of like endurance race. But for like XCO, so all I have during XCO is basically just my 3-second and then my normalized power, and that's basically it. The one thing to add to that, though, is the only time I really use the power data in a mountain bike race is if I'm in the very fortunate situation to be fast enough to be riding away from everybody on my own.
Yeah.
And I just want to make sure that I'm not,
That's one of those
instances. Hurting myself. Or I guess if I was bridging up to, and it was a really long bridge and I knew that I kind of couldn't overcook myself. But otherwise, I'm not looking at the numbers during a mountain bike race.
Right.
And then in a criterium, it's the same thing. I'm not looking at the numbers. It's there. It is what it is until I get into a breakaway or until I'm trying to bridge or something like that. That's when I use those to kind of measure things.
Yeah,
So
I will say I do have a second screen that has power so that if I'm out of the group in a breakaway situation,
Toggle over to it.
I might toggle over to it. But when I'm in the group, focus is 100% on the group dynamics.
Yep.
It has to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because then it's like somebody attacks, well, you can either go with it or you can't.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter what the number is. Like you're either there or you're not. So.
Yep. There's two principles that I think are like, because somebody's listening to this that has like 47 data fields and they're like, you guys are missing out, right?
Hey,
and then
if it works for you.
yeah, and then the other person is
That
saying,
just says you're not racing hard
yeah,
enough.
or another person says you have one data field and that's far too much. You shouldn't be looking at data at all. But the point is, like I feel like one governing thing that you have to keep in mind is cognitive load.
Yep.
Some people can maintain more, some people can maintain less. Also, I think that what you should look at is, you should remember is the fact that you can get all the data afterward.
Yep.
But what data will change your performance during that event, right? And that's like how you basically should decide. If you don't use one of the data fields that everybody else says you should use, then don't use it. Or if you use one that everybody says is useless, use it. If you really find it useful and that it ends up helping your racing. So,
Well, I could imagine a situation where somebody who's used to having a lot of data fields would feel stressed by not having those data fields.
yes.
Yeah, sure.
And that might introduce a whole bunch of cognitive load that,
right.
just having the data fields might bring your cognitive load down. So whatever works for you. Obviously, we all do very different things, but test it out, try it out, see, if something works better for you, go that way.
If I was doing something super long, I would probably I might throw on something like kilojoules maybe.
Yeah.
Just to keep track
Should
of. But
advise a fueling strategy.
I don't know. I mean like really long.
You should have a fueling strategy based on time. I don't think I would look at it and be like, oh,
Yeah, it's
now
a
I'm
good
going to do
point.
some math based on my
Yeah, but
kilojoules.
time can't
and
tell you
change it.
everything. The intensity over the course of the ride.
You should know this ahead of time.
Yeah,
You should know
what
if you're
you
doing
mean,
a
yeah.
9-hour race, like
it's reasonable.
what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. A pre-race plan would certainly trump that. I guess if you don't know of the route, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of like a situation where it would be useful. So, but yeah.
It could serve as a kilojoule measure could serve as a good reminder of when to eat.
Yeah.
And you could do a time one too.
additional
Just
one.
go. bloop, bloop,
Yeah, I suppose.
bloop.
Yeah.
I've set that on where you forget to turn it off. Yeah, and you're like, I did it for a race. I'm like, why are you beeping?
Can we cover that one? Yeah, like during a race, it drives me nuts for sure when
To
my
hear
head
everyone
unit's
else's
going off. But then when
computers?
everybody
Oh.
else is like beeping or going off. In fact, one time during a crit, there was a guy that we were racing with, and he was getting text messages, and we were in a breakaway, and bloop, 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 and it kept beeping, and I wanted to. It was tough. So
That's a good
Snag
tactic.
his phone out of his pocket.
and if
freak
you're racing with
everybody
me,
out
just
around
make
you.
your head unit beep.
I'm going to keep a
fall apart.
metronome in my pocket.
Yeah, so that's how to use it. In fact, actually, because of like events like criteriums or mountain biking, where it's less, I'm less concerned with seeing the data and everything else. That's why I use just my watch mostly for most of that stuff, just because I don't really have to have it right in front of me. So it's helpful. Kevin, he says, "Hi all, thank you so much for the podcast. It's a valuable resource for training. Probably only Jonathan can help me out with my question." That's untrue. More people can. He says, "My bike and I together are 60 kilograms. Very, very light in this case. And when there's crosswinds or it's gusty wind, I really feel it. Are there techniques for smaller people to ride a bit more stably?" I think that's a word. And safely in the wind, other than just hiding behind Nate and Pete.
You go to Popeyes. Hey.
Hey. Thank you very much and love the podcast. So in this case, Kevin's question, I think we can all chime in on this for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Because we've all been tossed around on crosswinds. However, it to varying degrees varies. Nate.
I'm just going to let you guys answer this
Oh,
one.
look at this. Yeah.
No, but really, I mean...
Well, you've been tossed around on crosswinds plenty. I can think
They're
of
not
like
that bad,
rides
though.
or races that we've done where you're like scared because of the crosswinds. It's happened before. Time trial.
The only thing I don't like is when it grabs your front wheel and shakes it.
Well, I mean, that's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
That's like probably point number one, right, Amber? It's
Oh,
not
yeah.
it's not that the wind is hitting you from the side, but what happens is, and we actually covered this on a podcast with Envy that we did, where they were talking about, and this is like an important point, what causes like a lot of instability in a gust is when your wheel turns, right? And the reason that your wheel turns is because of a pressure differential from the front to the back of your wheel. So if there's more pressure on the front than the back, it turns your wheel, or vice versa, right? I think it's usually just more on the front than the back. But so like really good wheel designers take that into account, and they try to design a wheel. If it behaves well on crosswinds, they design a wheel to minimize that pressure differential or try to balance it out. And that's why your bike you may go a little bit, you may lean when the wind hits you, but you're not getting thrown out of control.
Right. And this is, so if you have, let's say you're in a time trial and you're running a rear disc. If the wind's hitting the disc, whatever, because that wheel is stable and it's not going to go anywhere. But when it hits your front, it's your front wheel that pivots with the fork. And this is, we talked about this before, protecting your front wheel in a race. That's where you're most vulnerable. And the same thing holds true in a crosswind. So, one of the things you could do is just, if you're running a really deep dish front wheel, if you have the option to run a shallower profile on the front, that can help right off the bat. I was told by an aerodynamics expert long ago that dropping your shoulder into the wind can give you a little bit of like a sail effect, using kind of, Bernoulli's principle.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's true, so I haven't done the math on it.
I've wondered that too, right? When I'm riding, I'm like, this wind that's hitting me, instead of hating it, can I utilize it somehow?
Right.
We talked to Chris Yu, and especially with wind tunnel, if you have a tailwind that's faster than like what your speed is, or like close, you should you can sit up and put out more power. And Chris is like, that never usually happens, but in Reno, I swear that happens all the time. You just probably have had this happen to you.
Pete and I rode on Saturday, and we actually saw geese getting blown over. It was that windy, so it was a rough day.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and we felt that very thing. Well, not enough, if I'm frank. We got lots of headwind, and then it seemed to die down once we turned around.
I've done a triathlon.
Right? Very uneven, those wind gods.
Where I think it was in Davis, where you were in one direction, it was a 30-mile-per-hour headwind, but on the other way, it's a 30-mile-per-hour tailwind. And I sat up, and it's the weirdest sensation because you're going 30, and it's silent. You know, I usually hear wind, and it's silent because you're going like there's zero headwind and tailwind.
It's like balanced out.
Yeah. I was doing like 200 watts, so 30. But anyways, that's just to your point.
Yeah.
You can use your body as a sail.
Yeah, exactly.
And when we were, and with that very like concept, there are people, there are brands that have tried to design wheels too, kind of actually like a disc wheel in particular. I'm thinking of, I can't remember which brand, but
most discs at certain yaw angles, you'll get lift. You'll be pushed forward. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, they kind of push for that. So yeah, it's definitely there's something to that. I find that I do something that like when the wind hits me. So it's funny when we were prepping for this, I was trying to think like moving my head and trying to think of how I move into the wind. But when the wind hits me on my left, I find that I lean my head to the right. And in my mind, it's like a subconscious thing. It's not like I'm like sideways or something, but it's because I'm trying to think like if I just, and aerodynamics experts and engineers, reach out to us on this if you have any
we'd love
insight.
to hear from you.
It'd be interesting because I always think like I grew up like on like sailing with my dad and stuff too, and we did that, and I always think like if I just like am a harsh, hard surface to this wind versus kind of giving a bit, maybe I'm not getting the possible benefit from it. It's really tricky to say.
Right.
But when we get into dealing with like the stability issues in general, I think there are probably some good like basic tips we can give, right?
I think one of the things, so we mentioned your front wheel is where you are the most vulnerable. So actually shifting your weight forward a little bit. Usually when I'm racing, I like to keep really light hands on the bars, because if you do hit something in the road, or you're not going to overcompensate and cause any issues. But when there's a really strong crosswind, I find actually moving my weight forward more on the handlebars, more on the front end, can help with that stability. I think mentally framing it too, because when you're in crosswinds, especially if they're gusty, it's unnerving, and so you tend to get nervous, which means you tend to tense up, and then if you do feel a gust, you tend to overreact. And what you really want to do is be really supple and non-reactive. So one of the ways that you can kind of do that is to mentally get yourself in the mode of, I'm just going to let the wind move me. I'm just going to let it move me. And then when you do that, it's not realistically going to move you all that much. I think there's very, very rare instances where the wind is actually going to move you. Even if you're a lighter person on a lighter bike, you're still a person on a bike. Like it's going to take a lot of wind to actually move you. So just mentally allowing the wind to move you, which all that means is you're not going to react as strongly and you're not going to tense up as much, which is going to make you a lot safer and again, more supple and non-reactive on the bike.
I do have something to add. So we have a time trial here that starts off Franktown.
That's what I was going to mention.
A huge crosswind, and it's a downhill, and you're like fresh, and you're sprinting like Jonathan for the first minute. But you're
It's a great tactic. Everybody racing against me, please employ it.
but you're in the aero bars. Into what Amber, this is what I do too. Is what Amber just said. Is I think of it as almost like you're surfing with the wind. So
Yeah.
you're not fighting it. You're just like
Yeah, sure.
You
That's a
get this
great-
lean angle. You're leaning into the wind, which feels really weird. And if it's gusty, that can be really unnerving because it's like leaning on someone and they walk away. But in Franktown, it's usually pretty steady.
Yeah.
Or it's gusty steady. And yeah, you just kind of have to feel comfortable that you're going to be a little bit sideways in the aero bars, which is like you hit
Unnerving.
40 there too, right?
Precarious
Oh, yeah.
position.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At high speed.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
But
There's-
momentum is your friend.
Yes, and
Keep
tension through
No,
the whole
seriously, keep
structure.
pedaling.
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely,
Keep pedaling.
exactly.
Yeah, like if you ease up on the pedals, you basically take, because you actually stabilize your body a ton by applying pressure to the pedals, right?
Yep.
If you're just perched on the saddle and then your hands, you've got a center of gravity that's sitting way up there, right, as is, and then it's all just sitting on that saddle. Whereas once you start pedaling, you start to anchor yourself to a lower point, and then you also start
More
to
connected with the bike.
Yep, exactly. And everything just handles better. I mean, if you ask even the same principle even applies to like race cars. Like cars handle better when under acceleration and tension, right, throughout the whole thing. So that's a huge thing. When the gust hits you, it's a natural reaction to kind of stop and to panic, but just keep your legs moving, keep pedaling through. And there are situations, we've ridden the bike course at Kona, and that wind is exceptional.
That's insane.
It's
Yeah.
exceptional.
It's because the gust, like you said, if it's not steady, but there's the
topography.
outcroppings,
Yeah.
Yes.
and then it pushes you seriously up a lane in the road,
full lane.
full lane. It's crazy.
And when you're talking about the inconsistency, like there is no consistency there because you're riding, then suddenly it hits
Consistency
you.
would be
and then it goes away.
challenging, but not as scary.
Yes.
Right.
So I feel for everyone. That's why too a lot of people don't ride big front deep dish wheels in
Right.
Kona.
Yep.
Yeah.
They ride like a 50.
Yeah, it's which is strange for full distance triathlon, to see that. So there are exceptional circumstances.
Yeah.
And I mean, you've been in situations, Amber, where you step off your bike and then it just and you hold it and it flies up.
Well, that wasn't me, but a friend of mine was racing Gila one year, and Gila's notorious for the wind. And I've raced there a lot of years where it's brutally windy. In fact, one time I was in a break with two really, really tiny people, and I have never gotten lower on a bike before in my life trying to hide behind them. But one year, apparently, not a year I was racing, but they were telling me that people actually got off their bikes because it was so dangerous. And at that point, I mean, if you're in a race and the wind is that, if it's one of those exceptional times where it's actually dangerous, like people, you'll know and you'll just get off the bike. But people were getting off the bikes and standing on the side of the road, and the wind was coming up behind them and lifting the bike out horizontally as they were holding the top tube,
Sketchy.
which is amazing.
So,
Cape Town Cycle Tour. Google that. Google Cape Town Cycle Tour
I've seen
wind,
this.
and you'll see what you're talking about.
yeah.
This is what I experienced on Mauna Kea, a headwind like this.
yeah. Haleakala.
Haleakala. Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is really, that is
Very rare.
Yeah,
very
very
rare. So even on really, really, really windy days, you might feel like it's unsafe, but really just keep in mind, like it would take a lot of air going very fast to actually move you on the bike. And I think you can really trust that it's probably not. And I like that image of surfing because I think it'll just give you that confidence to not react.
Skiing powder too.
Yeah.
Same idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Move with it.
The two words that stand out to me, that supple and non-reactive, is really important because I think that's a very good description of what you do. I actually take my fingers and I make sure that I can dance my fingers, so to speak, when I'm holding on. Like I'm not gripping with my fingers, so I'll just make sure my fingers are loose enough to be able to move. That's kind of like a systems check, so to speak, to make sure that I'm in the right spot. And to give you an idea, looking back at the recorded wind during the ride that we did, even this weekend, there were gusts that we were dealing with that were over 50 miles an hour. And that still, I didn't feel was unsafe.
Right.
It was just, you just had to be in that supple, non-reactive state and be okay with leaning, and it would work out. Now, I'm probably going to get hate mail for this, so I apologize. But so I'm just going to step right into it. I think because plenty of people are going to say, well, I was blown off my bike, and Chris Froome was recently even blown off his bike. And even Chris Froome admitted the fact that he had a lapse of concentration that then led him to be vulnerable to that. And that is, now when you're in the aero position on a TT bike, you're in a very vulnerable position to start with. But then if you have any sort of lapse of concentration or technique, then you're very vulnerable.
Yeah, no matter how momentary.
Yeah. And it doesn't take a big gust in that case, but it also, for that same reason, doesn't take a big crack in the road, doesn't take a big anything to throw you off at that point, right? So it's really like when I find that when I ride in the wind, I'm exhausted because of the mental focus needed throughout that whole process. It's not even necessarily the increased like a physical aspect of it. It's just mentally exhausting because I'm trying to remind myself to be supple and non-reactive amidst this crazy storm and then constantly dealing with it. So you just really have to stay frosty, as they say, right? Like stay focused, in position, be spot on with your technique, and then don't stop pedaling, and it'll work out.
Right.
Like it's it's not as bad as people think. So should we? Oh, one quick thing, jumping, and I know this applies to probably not many people on here, but watching cross nationals last week, some people were jumping there, so there's something. But a lot of people, as soon as jumping feels uncomfortable. Period.
So we're talking about leaving the ground, not jumping away from a field.
Yes. Yeah. Very good. Thank you, Chad. But that and going in and dealing with wind in that scenario is very scary because your wheels aren't planted on the ground. So then the wind really does what it was or what it will with you, right? Like it can just toss you all over the place. And usually what happens is we go extremely stiff and then we end up like the wheels. It's like the sweep the leg, so to speak. Like the wind knocks the wheels out from underneath you and you fall over. So, but even then, just to show you that wind can be dealt with, and many times we overreact and don't manage it effectively. If you watch the best mountain bike riders that are jumping or best motorcycle riders, anything else like that, they manage the wind really effectively. They carve into the wind off the jump, and they stay supple and non-reactive, and they anticipate the fact that they're going to get tossed from one side to the next, and that's okay. That's just what it is. So it's really all about learning to manage it. And so much of that comes down to that mind state of being calm and just making sure the technique's in place. So it can work. Kenny says, Chad, this is specifically for you, and we'll just leave after this. He says, I have mixed a half scoop of unflavored protein powder in my carbo drink for century and double century races for several years now. I was told that the protein helps cyclists reduce muscle damage and increase the time to fatigue. And he cites a study here from NCBI.
2003 study. We'll talk about it.
Cool. He says, I am curious if protein during cycling is actually helping, or is it potentially inhibiting my ability to take in approximately 90 grams per hour, and he says 90 grams of carbs per hour, based on the 1-to-1 fructose to glucose ratio mentioned in a previous podcast. Thanks for a great podcast and thanks for the great podcast and training, 5 stars. So where should we start with this one? I've heard this before that protein basically helps it so that your muscles don't break down. Basically, is like the common thing that I've heard.
Yeah.
Where do you want to start with this one, Chad?
We kind of went a lot of different directions on this one. So it's an opportunity to talk about a few different things, and some of them aren't specifically about protein ingestion.
Should we talk about the study first, maybe?
Yeah.
Because you read something like that, and if you don't dive into the details, it's really easy to take away the wrong information. Yeah, which is just another case for why, if you're gonna hook, line, and sinker accept what an extract is telling you, or an abstract is telling you, it's probably a good idea to get into the weeds a bit and actually look at the study before you go and.
Yes.
Right. And for those listening, if you're looking at these peer-reviewed journal articles, the way that they're structured, there's usually an abstract, which gives you like a summary of the entire article. They'll do like a really brief touch on the methods, the results, and the conclusions. So it's a great way to kind of get a bite-sized summary of what a study is. But because it doesn't offer more granular detail, it's hard to really dig into how effective their experimental design was, and really how trustworthy the results and conclusions are.
Yeah,
so.
and there's the criticism that the study's old, so it's probably not up to date anymore, or it's not relevant anymore. And there's a strong argument against that. I mean, old science is still good science in many cases, most cases maybe. This would be a case where not so much, because, for instance, one particular criticism with this 2003 study, it's titled Effects of a Carbohydrate Protein Beverage on Cycling Endurance and Muscle Damage. It's by Saunders et al. They saw optimal fueling rates at 60 kilograms or 60 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram per hour. And we've long since dispelled the fact that that's all you can absorb. I mean, if it's strictly glucose, yeah, that's the case. But now we recognize there's co-transport with fructose. We've now starting to see that we can push that fructose up higher so that we're going well above, in some cases, 90 grams per hour. So it's not even a shortcoming. That's the information they had at the time. So they based understandings on that, thinking, well, if the body can only get this much carbohydrate, then maybe, and to their credit, they did acknowledge that maybe that protein, I mean, they closed, their conclusion said, further research is necessary to determine whether these effects were the result of higher total caloric content of the carbohydrate plus protein beverage or due to specific protein mediated mechanisms. So not just saying it's protein that made these times to exhaustion grow, they're saying it could be the fact the protein provided more calories, which is in addition to the 60 grams of carbohydrate they're already getting, and maybe that was it.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about the results because we said this and somebody said no way and the other person said an expletive. No, something way.
Yeah.
She will be remain nameless.
It'll help us.
So what they were doing is they were writing pretty much a threshold, and the percentage, they do it always as a percentage of VO2 max, but it's pretty much threshold. When they add protein, they wrote 40% longer at threshold.
Yeah.
We're like,
What?
wait, like, so I put some, like, we could all just do it, right?
People have done like
You know how fast
a
I
whole
would do
lot
this?
for less percentage.
Well, exactly. Like, can you imagine anything? Like, if you could ride at
Yeah.
40% longer at threshold with some protein. So
Yes.
just the magnitude of that
That's
would make me
crazy.
think that, like,
Sounds
that's
a
not
bit
just
too good to be true.
calories too.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on, but that would be
That's a good
insane.
principle. That's a good principle of the too good to be true thing.
Yes.
It's definitely, it still even applies to scientific research. Like if you see something like that,
Yeah.
and once again, like you said, Chad, at the end, they basically say, now we don't know if this is specifically
Yeah, they
because of
acknowledge
protein
that.
or this.
Yeah.
But
And you
then
can't-
then to your point too, Amber, it's also going into the methods that they used when they were actually testing and going through everything
Well,
else.
and you
It's
can't,
a
you
lot
can, you can never cherry pick a single study just because it supports your bias. It's like, oh, I want to believe that, so that's probably the true one.
Right.
That's probably the
we
best
just stop
research
at the
possible.
title in that case. We didn't even go to the abstract.
Right.
No, it's not the title. It's the journalist who wrote about it.
Yeah.
What their title is.
Exactly. Yes. We just go to the tweet. That's
Yep.
it. And then
Yep.
it's taken, right?
Well, so two of the criticisms that I didn't mention yet, and one's pretty wide, it impacts a lot of these studies. First off, though, you have to look at isocaloric versus, in this case, isocarbohydrate. So yeah, they use the same level of carbohydrate on both the study groups, both the demographics, but they didn't match calories. So if they had matched calories, then it wouldn't be as easy to criticize.
Yeah.
And on top of it, I've talked about this before, the times to volitional exhaustion.
Yeah.
I mean, Nate put it a particular way one time, said, if you can ride at this wattage for 20 minutes and then someone puts a gun to your head and said ride for 25 minutes, you'll do it.
Yeah.
You'll find a way.
Yeah.
Find a way.
Yeah.
And good day, bad day.
Yeah.
I mean, there are times where you get on to do, maybe when we used to do 20-minute tests, you knew whether or not you had it in you to do a good 20-minute test that day. It just wasn't there.
Yeah.
Then you come back on a good day and it is there.
Yeah.
So on a good day, I know you can push farther. I mean, your volitional time to exhaustion will increase.
Yeah.
They've done studies where, like, you all out say, okay, $200 more if you can last one more minute.
Oh, yeah.
Like everybody does.
Or you're at
Suddenly
20
they're
minutes and they
faster.
tell you you're at 18 and you manage to stretch it to 20 minutes because
Yeah.
that's what's expected.
Yep. I'm going to change the distance of your TT course because you don't have time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's something actually. So really quick before we dive in deeper into this, into the protein and
Yeah,
carbohydrate
the actual
part.
question.
Yeah.
But that same principle, I don't have any sort of gun to put to head, so to speak.
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be that extreme. I mean,
Yeah, but what I do during the ramp test is I tell myself, I pull the gun. No, just
I'm going to kick your door in the middle of the
no. I actually tell myself, and because so here, and this could vary for each person, right? But I find that when I test and when in any fitness testing scenario, maybe I just can't push myself as hard as everybody listening to this, but I find that whatever I get for my numbers in my training, if I bump that up just a touch, maybe 1 or 2%, I can still manage my training well, and I might get even more. So rather than bumping it up during the ramp test, because it's a really good format for this, because it's not, once again, like a 20-minute sustained thing, during that, when I get to the point where I think I'm failing, I tell myself 3 more minutes. So, and then I just, you can do it, just chunk it up, right? We've talked about that plenty of times, 10 seconds, 25, whatever you need to do. But once I get to the failing point, I tell myself 3 more minutes. I haven't made it to the 3 yet, but I have made it further than I would have otherwise. And it just goes to this point that whatever you think your failure point is, chances are it's just beyond that, or maybe even further beyond that than just beyond.
Yeah.
So you can always get a little bit more. I mean, that's probably why we always get really good numbers when we race, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's been more than a few times where I'll finish my lead out effort and I'll think like, that is all I've got. And then suddenly someone will attack and I will be the only person in the team in position to go. And I will think like, I have nothing, but somehow you find it, because it's just, if the job is there in front of you and needs to be done, you just do it. I don't know where it comes from, but
it's there.
it's there.
Yeah.
Kate Bates, actually, who's former world champion on the track, one time told me, when you're at that point where you think that you're dying, it's a nice reality check to remind yourself how far from actual death you really are.
Yeah, not there yet.
You're not gonna
Not
die.
dead yet.
On the protein and carb side, Chad, like, should we dive into that?
Because we all had the reaction that we did,
Yeah.
it was like, no way, no effing way.
I want to just real quick back to a couple of principles when you're looking at studies like this before we dive into this. One is if you see a study like this that seems like it's too good to be true, do search keywords that might bring up alternate, results that are different than what you're looking for. Or if you're looking for a particular bias, search the opposite of your bias or search the opposite of your assumption and see what other studies come up that may support a different point of view. And then the other thing that you can do, especially if it's an older study like this, is you could look up what studies have cited this. And then oftentimes there will be studies that either agree with it and confirm the results or actually refute the results, which is what we found in this case. So those are two things that you can kind of do to evaluate a particular study when you're looking at it.
And look for reviews.
Yeah.
I think
Where
we
they-
were
These
talking
are
about this.
great.
where they
Yeah.
combine multiple studies.
You guys were talking about this, and I looked on it's like PubMed or something, and it just on the right it says similar articles review. Clicked on that, and then it was not this is not the consensus. I guess
Right.
I think you're gonna.
Yeah,
Right.
and this particular review was done several years later. So we went from 2004 to now 2013. It's by McClellan, Pasiakos, and Lieberman. It's called "Effects of Protein in Combination with Carbohydrate Supplements on Acute or Repeat Endurance Exercise Performance." A systematic review, and we'll link to that. They looked at 28 studies, and they all have to fulfill particular criteria, amongst which ingestion, infusion of various forms of protein with carbohydrate. 60 grams per hour was considered optimal. So again, maybe a chink in their armor, but still consistent. And looked at how the addition of protein, in a lot of cases, isocaloric, so they matched for calories, matched for carbohydrate. I mean, many of these did it right, but they were still kind of influenced by that 60 gram per hour limitation. There were only a couple studies who exceeded it. So again, I mean, you have to try to find that distinction between, is it just more calories or was it the protein that made the impact? And by and large, across these 28 studies, they show that they're really, in fact, to quote, when carbohydrate is delivered at optimal rates during or after endurance exercise, protein supplements appear to have no direct endurance performance enhancing effect. That was the conclusion for this entire review, not just individual studies within the review.
That also ties it down to the main objective of what we're talking about, which is performance improvement, right?
Yeah. So, and that's kind of a different question the way he's asking it. He's asking it, if I'm trying to get 90 grams in, is it going to be hard for me to get all 90 grams in if I'm also supplementing protein on top of it, which is what we'll talk about next.
And two, so this first study had such a huge magnitude, right? Like 40%. You think that you could repeat that, maybe get a 10% or a 20%er in there, like all the time, that you could get a p-value that's good enough for this. But so again, if it's too good to be true, look, research.
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
it'd be great. So where do you want to start? I guess on
So
the protein.
first off, let's say it's
carb side.
unlikely that it's harming his performance. And actually, I got some specific questions so we can determine just that.
Cool.
So as far as protein and carbohydrate interaction, first and foremost, as long as you have enough carbohydrate on board and you're ingesting carbohydrate, you're probably not going to do a heck of a lot of damage in terms of protein. It's not like your body just jumps straight to protein. I mean, if carbohydrate's there, any impact on protein is going to be minor if it's present at all. And keep in mind, he's talking one-day events here. We're not talking about chronic protein deficiency. This is a
Right.
very different topic. So if he's talking about staving off intra-event, so within the event protein loss, it is a valid concern. But again, not if you're not carbohydrate depleted. There was some science or some research to support that ingesting protein during an event, in particular, they used whey protein. Having that present in the GI tract did allow for greater glycogen synthesis rates, but that assumed there were down periods. I mean, if you're working, I don't know that glycogen is going to synthesize at the same rate, even with a protein influence. If you're doing a bunch of work, it's not really how it works.
Right.
But as far as the ratio of protein to carbohydrate that you can get away with, I mean, a pretty typical recommendation is like a 1 to 10 ratio. So even if you are going to supplement protein, you're not putting a heck of a lot in there. And in particular, this is from Mike Isertel, the RP diet author. He says that higher protein content is recommended if muscle sparing is a concern. A lot of athletes, especially for one-day events, it's not a big concern. So that 1 to 10 ratio is probably all you need if you need it at all. If you have different, actually, we'll get to that. I'm getting ahead of myself. But understand that the metabolic pathways are different.
Right.
Right. We're not trying to push protein into the cell or in the same way. They're not using the same transport mechanism. It's not really they're not going to impede one another. The concern is how much food can you get in? If taking the protein is causing you to be able to ingest less carbohydrate, then yeah, that's a concern, especially if your performance is tanking as a consequence of too low carbohydrate. But again, I don't think that's what he's describing here. So, and then I know he's talking about long events too, but because the carbohydrate expenditure and your ability to process protein is definitely dependent on intensity, then again, I mean, probably not a concern for him, because if he's going for 8 or 10 hours at a time or longer, I mean, double century, 200 miles takes people upwards of 10 hours a lot of the time. Probably not a limiter, probably not something that's limiting his performance in the moment.
Yeah, that's all logical.
And then on top of this all, again, we're talking a one-day event. Protein intake can be handled around the event. And I know it's a tall order when you're talking about being on the bike for 12 hours, and now you have to get that, what's a protein recommendation for endurance athletes is usually between 1 gram per kilogram per day up to 2 grams. So 1 to 2 grams. And with an athlete my size, about 185 pounds, so 84 kilograms, we're looking at anywhere from 85 to 170 grams of protein per day. And if I'm on my bike for 12 of those hours, it's really hard to get that in during the remaining 12 hours. But again, this is a one-day thing. You can only do so much damage in a single day. So just err on the side of performance in this case. Maybe don't even worry about the protein. Just see to it that you're getting enough carbohydrate to fuel the performance. Deal with the protein ramifications later. So for Kenny, I think the real question is, does anything actually need to change? Is he performing to expectation? Is he experiencing GI distress? I mean, he's talking about a half scoop, and I'm assuming that's per bottle. So 5 to 15 grams for a half scoop. I mean, a scoop's typically anywhere from 10 to 30 grams, depending on what you're using. So that puts him down to like a 1 to 6 ratio, which that's when you might say, I'm dealing with a bit of gastric distress because I've far exceeded that ratio recommendation. Is it an issue? Maybe it's not, though. If it's clearing your gut, it's probably being absorbed, right? So if it's not hanging up in there, you're probably not doing anything too wrong. And then another question might be to ask himself if he's losing noticeable amounts of muscle mass at the end of events like this. And even so, how much can you possibly lose over the course of a single day's event? I mean, even over the course of an Ironman or a triple century, God forbid.
And that's a hard thing to parse out from hydration status too.
Yes.
Like, it's just really hard to say.
Didn't even consider that.
Yeah, that's that, and that, I mean, that really gets to the root of this. Is it's always hard we put so many things into our bodies, and we have so many other things that are affecting performance that it is tricky to say. So I guess summing it up, Chad, on the protein side, if cyclists are taking in protein, does it stop them from taking in or from absorbing carbohydrate?
Nothing that I've found would say as much.
Yeah.
It's really just a question of, does it impact your capability to intake carbohydrate? Can you not take as much carbohydrate as you want to because you're also combining it with protein? Right. Yeah. Is there any GI distress? Is performance tanking? I mean,
sure. Right. Absolutely. Cool. Let's get into Carly's question. Says, hi all. First off, what's a TR podcast question without giving kudos to the 5-star podcast, and more importantly, the product itself? It's funny. Like, I saw one person this week said they were a bit upset, I think, and they sent in a question and they said, I am not going to give you credit by giving you like a positive review before I ask about that or ask my question. It's totally not needed. You don't have to do that. So I don't want to set that precedent. I realize that most people always write in and say that they enjoy the podcast or enjoy something else. You can just send in your question, but we like hearing that, of course, because we work hard on it. So we appreciate it just the same, Carly. She says, I jumped into consistent training about a year ago, and the solid indoor trainer road workouts helped me gain almost 50 watts in that year, landing me at 4.2 watts per kilogram and an upgrade to a Cat 3 and 3 state championship jerseys in one season. Carly is ripping.
Good season.
Awesome.
Yeah, and that is that's very high. Like that's a really good power to weight ratio, period. And what we've seen in terms of like female athletes to male athletes, that ranks her very, very high. Yeah, and she basically she probably competes with like pro level athletes with that sort of
pro level power.
Super impressive. So, one of the good habits I developed was foam rolling after workouts and before bed, which I think was a huge factor in preventing overuse injuries, which is her assumption. She says, unfortunately, I cut my season short with a broken collarbone. Not being able to weight that arm meant I couldn't foam roll, so I stretched instead and realized I'd lost a lot of flexibility that I had when I stretched after workouts. On the flip side, I went on a run and my IT band issues flared back up, which never happens when I foam roll. This is like the golfer short game, long game thing, right? That long lead in leads to my first question. Is it better to foam roll for injury prevention or stretch for flexibility? So that's kind of a complex question because we're dealing with a number of different things kind of inputting here. But I guess it really comes down to intention or goal on like what you're going for.
Yeah, or efficacy. So we'll talk about that. Both Amber and I have got a fair amount to contribute on this one.
Cool.
So stretching versus foam rolling have different intentions. The foam rolling is really about releasing fascial tension. And then supposedly stretching the idea is to increase usable muscular range of motion.
And I just want to jump in on the range of motion thing because I think a really practical way of looking at range of motion is to think anytime, like let's say you're on the bike, your body is trying to figure out the most efficient way of recruiting muscles to find optimal movement efficiency. And if you've got a lot of fascial adhesions or you have really constrained range of motion, then your body is only able to optimize within a lot of constraints. So range of motion is really about eliminating constraints so that your body can get closer to a true optimum for efficiency. So I think that's at least a way of conceptualizing what range of motion, what the benefit of range of motion might be.
And that both these things, whether it's rolling or stretching, have the same end to increase usable range of motion.
Yeah.
Emphasis on usable. We'll talk about that in a minute. So there's a lot of overlap between both the myofascial system and the muscular system because you can have fascial issues that lead to muscular issues, muscular issues that lead to fascial issues. And then when we're talking about fascia, I should probably describe what it is for those who don't know. I see it as sort of and it's described as such, a webwork of encasement shared across your entire body. So I kind of envision it as like a large seamless nylon pantyhose that runs from head to toe. You pull on it in one part, you may not recognize it, but it's putting tension on somewhere very different, which is why when you try to roll adhesions or trigger points, you always roll upstream and downstream to quote Kelly Starrett, because the pain may be localized right here, but what's actually causing it could be somewhere else.
Right. Absolutely.
So when it comes to stretching too, and typically we're talking about static stretching. Let's not get into passive and dynamic and all this stuff. Let's just say stretching. We're not rolling, we're stretching. It's purported rationale. So why people do it and think there's science to back this up. Sorry to say there's not a heck of a lot. So injury prevention, warming up, reduction of delayed onset muscle soreness or DOMS, and then performance enhancement. Those are 4 of the big hitters in this particular ball game. And I ask you, show me the research, steer me toward it, because I did a lot of digging yesterday and I came to the conclusion that if it kind of works, I might as well just say it kind of doesn't work. It's really the same thing. Trivial benefits, minor efficacy, equivocal findings, dubious results, effects were insignificant. These are terms I came across in the research for this. So, the science just isn't there, at least not for those 4 things. Yeah. As far as the fact that it feels good, yep.
Oh, yeah. It's a classic.
Love
Feels
stretching.
great. So for that reason alone, why not?
It's a classic flex, too, right? Stretch to, it's about to go down right now. I'm stretching, right? Yeah.
And then
Pre-race.
actual flexibility, there is research science to support that you do increase flexibility, but you have to ask yourself why you want to increase that flexibility.
Sure.
In a lot of cases, people try to improve flexibility in areas that don't benefit their discipline. So, for example, Eliud Kipchoge, best marathoner in the world, probably the best marathoner of all time. Inarguably, as he's the only guy who's gone under 2 hours.
He's fast.
Assisted though it may have been. Can't touch his toes. He can't even get close. So, I mean, how many runners worry about their hamstring flexibility when there's clearly, I mean, the literal best in the world has terrible hamstring flexibility. I do recognize that if your range of motion is limited, and especially if it's limiting to what you're trying to do, the position you're trying to get into on the bike, a position you're trying to remain comfortable and powerful in, absolutely address that and stretch away. But it's more likely that stretching actually leads to an increased tolerance of discomfort than changes in the actual muscle tendon structure, which is an argument for probably, in fact, I probably just threw a match on a gas can there because it'll come back on me. I'm okay with that because there's enough science on both sides to make it an arguable notion.
I believe for stretching for like strength sports or explosive sports, it's actually worse to stretch ahead of time.
Yep. Are you reading ahead?
Oh, no.
Yeah, because that's exactly the next point. There are other outcomes of stretching, and they're typically unintended ones. And this is why you don't see at track meets or a lot of sporting events these days, football games, soccer games, you don't see athletes doing static stretching anymore because it has been demonstrated that there is a reduction, an associated reduction in strength. There is a reduction in explosive power. So you're actually hobbling yourself before the event by doing something that you think is supposed to be beneficial. I mean, then overstretching, obviously, that's far more likely to lead to injury than to prevent it. There are a lot of cases where people stretch because they have an injury, and all they're doing is aggravating that injury. The same goes for DOMs. I have, damaged muscle. My muscles are sore. It makes sense that I would stretch them to relieve the pain, right? Quite the contrary. You can actually prolong the DOMS-related symptoms.
And we've spoken about that before, and that stretching has not been proven to improve DOMs.
Nothing short of basically complete abstinence from physical activity or amputation.
No,
will improve DOMs.
I favor the latter at times.
Ice baths will improve DOMs. So ibuprofen, like anything that gets the inflammation down.
An anti-inflammatory.
Those prevent long-term adaptations. But I can give you a bunch of pain medicine, and your DOMs will go away.
But is it gone? I mean, the underlying issue?
I think
the underlying issue, no, but
with ice.
I mean, you can avoid the pain. You can avoid the pain in a lot of ways.
Ice baths, I think the underlying inflation that's caused DOMs is gone. But that's not good to do long term.
Yeah.
We'll check on that.
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah.
I didn't want you to get flamed.
Thanks for
Something else I'm thinking of.
Covering them all up, right?
Okay, so we want to talk about my personal approach, and then we can all chime in on this.
Yeah, sure.
So I believe on focusing on relieving tension by targeting the fascial system. I think that's the only way to spend time. If you're going to dedicate time to flexibility work, roll it in all cases. Static stretches don't have any scheduled place in my repertoire. I do them because they feel good. I just did them before the podcast because it feels good, and I know I'm going to be in a shortened position this whole time. And after the podcast, I'll do it again because it feels good, but not because I think I'm improving my flexibility. Rolling, smashing, flossing. If these aren't terms you're familiar with, look them up.
Become a
Get any
supple
Kelly
leopard.
book. Yep.
Deskbound. Awesome.
Talked
or
about the
listen to the
upstream.
podcast that we did with him. Sorry, Chad.
Yeah, that's right. We did. Or you did.
Yes.
Address any upstream, downstream muscles or muscle groups from the source because, like I said, often it radiates or it's not where you think it is. And then often and consistently hit problem areas. And when we're talking about cyclists, they're pretty easy gets. I mean, just think of what's short when you're in a cycling position, trying to create a lot of power in that position. So obviously our hip flexors, so the muscles at your hips that bring your knee closer to your chest. Your quads, I don't think anybody needs me to explain what that is. The cervical and thoracic spine, so your upper back. So think of your neck and your upper back. We keep those in really unnatural positions for really long periods of time, and we're working hard all the while.
Posture check for everyone. And
I do it like 100 times a podcast.
Nate just threw the horns. He's leaning back. Nice. Awesome.
Your scapular protractors. So again, we roll our shoulders forward a lot. We get all bunched up and we get narrow, and there's a lot of benefit to doing that. I mean, it's far more aerodynamic. So whether we're doing it intentionally or unintentionally, it happens. And then our hamstrings, in some cases, I mean, if you spend a lot of time seated with your knee bent, hammies shorten up. But if you spend a lot of time standing, not as big of an issue. And then I'll always be a proponent of addressing muscular imbalances. So in the case of cyclists, again, if we have tight hip flexors, probably means we have weak glutes. Those things go hand in hand quite often. If we had tight scapular protractors, our pecs are tight, our shoulders are rolled forward, then our retractors that draw our shoulders back probably could use some attention. They're probably under-strengthened or at least underutilized. And then when it comes to running and IT band tightness in particular, that is a topic all on its own. We could do a whole pod, or at least a whole question dedicated to that only.
Yeah.
But it's well argued, and I fully agree that you can't stretch your IT band. It's a tendon. You're not meant to stretch tendons. Why do we insist on trying to stretch? Why do physicians tell us to stretch tendons?
Yeah.
Or in the IT band in this case. You can get a little stretch out of your tensor fascia latae, you know, that connects the IT band to our bony structures.
That one's really hard to get.
But it is.
It's
It
really
very
hard
is.
to
Yes.
get.
You get a massage therapist is the
Sure.
best with their thumb.
Really
it's
Yeah.
like
in there.
kind of on the side of your hip above your IT band.
You can use balls and smash it and roll
I've
it
had a
and
good
floss it and
massage
all that stuff.
therapist in Reno do that, and he weighed probably 280 pounds and used his
You got to
thumb.
get in there.
Yeah, oh yeah. I've tried doing it to people, and it like hurts my thumb.
It takes time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've had it like it took probably a few minutes of him just trying to like work through, and then once he got to it.
I've had some deep stuff rolled, and it's tricky to find. You have to put your leg in this position and resist, and they have to dig around. When they find it, ooh, you
Yeah.
know they found it.
I will use a tennis ball and roll around, and then you know.
Yeah, when you hit it,
you
oh,
know
there
when
it
you
is.
hit
Yeah.
it. It's really, but it
get a
is hard to
lacrosse
get
ball and
to.
you'll really know.
Yeah, and then it is hard to hold it there. Yeah.
But I think in the case of, who we talking to, Carly?
Yeah.
I forgot the name.
Or no, not Carly.
No, we're on a different question
forgive
now.
me. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
talking. Yeah, it's still Carly.
Okay.
Sheesh. I apologize,
So I
Carly.
think in the case why she recognized relief with one method of flexibility over the other is that she was probably rolling something that she wasn't even aware was connected to whatever was creating the knee issue.
Oh, yeah.
Most likely just either her outer quads or any of her glutes. I mean, all three of them. The big obvious glute max, the medius, the minimus. I mean, if she's rolling those hips, maybe she didn't recognize that she was getting some things that are all tied together in terms of this whole fascial system. And then finally, I'll just close my end of this with address range of motion limitations if they exist. I mean, don't invent them. None of us as cyclists need to be able to do Chinese splits. So you don't need to
surface
spend
away.
a lot of time in that position. I mean, unless you really want to, but it's not going to make you a faster cyclist. If you have postural compensations, then for sure. I mean, but you should know about that. Is it hard for you to get your hips forward and walk tall with your shoulders back and down? Well, yeah, there's some work to be done there. Do you feel pain through what should be a usable range of motion? I mean, when you try to move your arm in a complete circle, does it hang up somewhere? That probably needs to be addressed. And that's actually it.
Amber, what's your typical routine that you? I mean, I know that you're not racing pro anymore, and you're going to be spending a whole lot of time behind a desk, right? Now, but just
Still
the
on a
same. What? Yeah, exactly. Still riding, still doing all that stuff. So living a normal life, so to speak. What is your routine like, or what was it like when you were pro? How did it differ in terms of whether it was foam rolling or stretching, whatever it was?
Yeah, I really like stretching. I wouldn't do it before a workout or before a race, but it's something I really like to do before bed. It's just, for me, it's just really calming to my whole system. So I just do it because it feels good. I did a lot of foam rolling. And actually later in my career, I ended up with some knee issues. In healing the knee issues, of course, discovered that, oh, by the way, a lot of cyclists get this common overuse injury, which is your lateral quad becomes dominant, which pulls on the side, one of the tendons that pulls your patella a little bit out to the side. And that can cause some tracking issues with your patella. And our bodies are amazing, so your body will compensate. But if your patella isn't, which is your kneecap, isn't tracking appropriately, you can start to wear down the cartilage on the underside of it. So this is a really common overuse injury that a lot of cyclists have. And to avoid becoming quad dominant, it's not necessarily about having like a really flexible lateral quad, but you want to be able to use that quad in concert appropriately with, for example, the vastus medialis, which is a VMO, which is the kind of chunky
The
muscle
teardrop on the inside.
of your knee. So sometimes what I would do, especially in the off season to work on this, is I would foam roll the lateral quad to inhibit it a little bit before doing some weightlifting or before getting on the bike. And that would force me to rely a little bit more on the VMO. And I would also do some VMO activation exercises and a lot of glute activation exercises. And those they almost seem pointless because they're so minor. You're literally just training the neuromuscular activation. So for my glutes, for example, I could lie on my back with my legs up at knees bent at 90 degrees, sort of with your hip flexor flex the way you would be on the bike, and then just activating your glute. You're not lifting any weight, you're not strengthening, but you're just training your body to have that specific neuromuscular pattern. And then when I get on the bike, trying to remember to activate my glutes.
And then the VMO in particular, it doesn't contract until you're almost at full extension, right?
Right, right. So doing VMO activations would be like sitting with your legs straight out in front of you, and then just almost like trying to lift your leg off the ground, and you'll see that little VMO starts working really hard. Yep. And it's really basic. You don't have to do a lot of strength training. So I would use the foam rolling for recovery, but not necessarily on the IT band, to your point, but more on the lateral quad and hip flexors.
Yeah. We have a full post and we've referenced this a lot on the podcast, but I think it's an important one because a lot of people deal with knee stuff. And if you go on, it's on the forum.trainerroad.com, and it's how to fix knee injuries for cyclists. It's just what's worked for me. And then plenty of other people have chimed in on what's worked for them. And we have pictures of all the different things that we did or that I did and all the different stuff to be able to manage that. And I continue to do that. So I foam roll because it feels good. I don't necessarily find that foam rolling suddenly like unlocks any sort of like thing or fixes anything necessarily. It's just comfortable.
Yeah,
and
I get a tremendous benefit from addressing fascial issues. I mean, if I have a knot and I work on it, and I work upstream, downstream, I do it in a number of ways. Yep. Not only does it impact my sleep tremendously, which is why I usually reserve this for a half hour before bed.
It's a good idea. I like that.
Yeah, and I think that's a strong case for stretching too. It feels good. It winds you down.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yep.
But it sounds excessive, but it's changed my body, quite honestly, because all these little niggles that you try to work around, these compensations that you develop that you just accept as part of aging, you can address so many of them.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, the only thing that I would add that would be unique to what both of you have added is that in terms of like what you were talking about, like impingements in a joint and working on those, a lot of the time those may, and I'd say smell like stretching or smell like something where you're
or damaged muscle.
Yeah,
that isn't.
Yeah, exactly. Like you need to do something like that, and even. For me, like my hips just basically get locked in, and it's hard for me to, even though I go through the pedal stroke and watch my knee and it seems straight, it's straight at a great cost. There's a lot going on rather than it just being straight because it should be straight, right? So for me, at least working on impingements, especially in my left hip, but in my hips, I just basically, the capsules themselves don't seem to, whether they're not quite as open or they just get kind of locked into one spot. If I don't open those up, and there's a 90-90-90 move that I do, which you can see in that forum post, that really helps on opening up my hips. So I recommend getting over and checking that out. And Tucker is linking to it in the forum now. That really helps. Once I can do those, or if I'm doing those regularly, I don't tend to have any issues. So
Motion is lotion.
Ooh, nice. Second question from Carly. On a totally different tangent regarding metabolism, I'm fairly petite, clocking in at 5 foot 5 inches and not quite 120 pounds, yet I eat almost as much as my fiance, who works out as much as me and has 40 pounds of muscle on me, meaning 40 additional pounds of muscle to her. I'm curious about the science behind why muscle burns more fat, or why muscle burns more than fat, and if my high metabolism means my body is less efficient than others, which seems like it could be detrimental to an endurance athlete. So there's an assumption there, high metabolism. I just want to point out the assumption. Thanks for all that you guys do. I wouldn't be the athlete I am today without TR. Awesome. Good to hear. So, this is a common one. We hear this. If you get more muscle, you end up burning more because muscle burns more fat. That
doesn't necessarily make you more efficient, though.
Yeah, let's get into that, right?
Yeah. So I think she misunderstands what efficiency is, and it gets misunderstood quite often. I mean, if we look at efficiency just in terms of what it is, which is energy output or the work we do relative to what we take in, so how the fuel, whether it comes from endogenous stores or we eat it, it's how much work we get for every bit of energy we devote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, simply.
Yep. And with aerobic athletes, when we talk about efficiency, then it becomes more about aerobic efficiency. So basically more mitochondrial mass. We want to be able to do more work aerobically because we're endurance athletes and we need to stretch our fuel sources as much as possible. And the best way to do that is mitochondrial proliferation. More mito we have, the more aerobic enzymes, the more robust those mitochondria perform, the more work we can do for the less energy invested. Mm-hmm. So we become more efficient, and particularly more aerobically efficient. Mm-hmm. So you can think of it almost in terms of fuel economy, but instead of miles per gallon, it's more akin to watts per gram of carbohydrate.
Yeah.
Or glucose.
Yeah.
Yep. So in her case, man, 230 watt FTP at 120 pounds, that she's doing a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I don't even know how much she's working out too. So, I I mean, there are a couple things we don't know about her fiance. How often does he work out? How often does she work out? And because if she's more active, then it stands to reason that she probably can get away with eating as much as he does. He does have an extra 40 pounds of muscle on his body, but what's his FTP? How much work can he do? It's hard to.
That's what I always think about when I see riders with like huge FTPs, like
me.
Yes, exactly.
I'm coming back, everyone.
There he is. Nate's back. He was out for a bit. He's
Well, I
back.
was
Yeah,
wanted
of
you
course.
guys to talk.
Yeah, thank you, Nate. There's actually a German cross-country mountain bike rider. He's tall. I think he's probably around your height. And I saw the other day that he did it was like an 8.5 hour ride, and he averaged 270 watts for it. And I was just thinking about the amount of food you'd have to eat just to fuel that work.
Or fat you'd have to burn, but either way, fuel.
Right,
Yeah.
fuel, right?
Yeah.
And that's one thing that as we've talked about this before, but as your threshold rises, you do have to fuel the work more. Where it comes from is a different story, but you do have to fuel the work more.
Okay, so Carly, here's what to think of, because I think maybe between my wife and me, probably similar stuff. One thing is work out as much as me. How many people say they work out as much
You're
as you
doing air
cyclists?
quotes, right?
Yeah, air quotes. I go to the gym and I'm there for 5 hours a week. Yeah. Way different if you're lifting weights and doing stair stepper stuff than if you're doing trainer road workouts the whole time and pedaling. The type of working out is very, very different. And if you're swimming versus running, all burn different calories at a different time. Second one is for every pound of you're raising your basal metabolic rate, like how many calories you burn per hour if you don't move. For every pound of muscle, about 50 calories. So he should have a higher basal metabolic rate. So you would think then that you would eat, if you ate the same amount, you would gain weight if he was maintaining weight, right? If everything else was consistent. One thing is I think people are really bad at measuring how much you eat. And one person might sneak a little block of cheese at night. And that's could easily be 400 calories, right?
You have a Cliff Bar, or you have something like that. You're adding 200 calories.
Which
right
is
there.
too how much dressing you put on your salad. Some people can go
Totally.
crazy on the olive oil. And you can it's hard to know how much you're eating.
Anybody that's tracked calories or counted macros knows that. It's
once you
really
start weighing
difficult.
it, you're like, whoa.
Well, and even the nutritional labels, there's
off.
there's error in the nutrition labels. So I mean,
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
And some by crazy amount. I remember I saw something they were taking gas station muffins and they underreported by 600 calories.
Oh my gosh.
It was they already said they were 600, but they're really 1,200. Something crazy like that.
Sorry, the look on Chad's face.
that'll
is
get you through a good
it's
workout.
Such a bummer. I mean, 600 calories, that's like a third of someone's diet.
Hey,
The
either
look
that
on-
or it's great
Yeah,
because
one of
then
the
you're
two. Lots of fuel.
That's right.
But the look on your face right there, Chad, was no, the muffins I ate this morning. That was
Yeah.
I'm a big muffin guy.
In general, Costco muffins, look up those. I forget, but they are a ton of calories.
Muffins are
Those are
a crime
huge.
against nature. I mean, they're a crime against endurance athletes. That's
Oh,
for
yeah.
sure.
Well,
Well, I
Unless you're
hope that's the
using
new
them to fuel
thing.
the workout.
Everyone should bring Chad muffins. Muffins and beer.
Beer only.
The next thing is your step count. So I don't move during the day. My step count on average is 2,000,
Yeah.
my 7-day average. My wife's is 20,000. That's without her running.
Yeah.
It's just
That's
crazy.
amazing.
She
Yeah.
just walks around and she doesn't leave the house. She's walk 10 miles. It's
crazy.
like a little, we call her a border collie. It's people who can't.
moving everywhere.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
a lot of people who just can't sit. And if you're at a desk job, or if you have an active job, if you're in healthcare or something, you're on your feet, you're a teacher.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You work outside.
Yeah, that's neat. So that's that non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So just because it's not considered exercise doesn't mean you're not burning a bunch of calories.
Right.
Yep. And the other crazy thing is how much you fidget. And some people, when they eat more, they fidget more. But some people are just fidgeters. And I should have looked up the exact amount of calories, but it is a significant amount. I want to say 100 to 700 calories per day with just fidgeting. And
I fidget a lot.
I was at and you're pretty small too. I was we just did this, and I went to my kids' child or Christmas pageant, and I was sitting there, and a bunch of kids singing songs around my kids, and I was watching everybody. My wife, the entire time, she was
She's
moving her
fidgeting,
feet.
yeah.
And then other people, they're very still. They didn't move the whole time. And some people, they're just it's they must hear music in their head, a different song, and they're
Yeah.
playing the drums.
Yeah.
And that can help you burn more calories too. So just because Carly, your husband or your fiance has 40 more pounds, there's so many other things that are so hard to track. And these things are so unless you get in a metabolic ward where they're like measuring the like what you're breathing and they can tell how many calories you're burning. It's like a
Direct
sealed
calorimetry.
room.
Yeah.
It's really, really hard to do all this because the labels are wrong. You don't know how many calories you're burning. Like your power meter could be off a little bit. You don't know exactly what your efficiency is. This is all kind of like roundabouts. And if you are, so you might say, well, why would I ever track calories then if this is all crazy? What you kind of do is, you see this too on forums all the time. Let me step back. You'll see people saying, I'm eating below my caloric intake or my caloric expenditure, yet I'm not losing weight. Why is that? And well, it's because you're not measuring something right.
Pretty simple. Yeah.
And what you just do is you can, if you want to lose weight and you're tracking your calories, keep lowering what you're adjusted, like what you think you're burning by 100 calories or 200 calories until you start losing weight. And then once you get to a reasonable weight loss of maybe 1 pound per week, then you can like maintain that. But all the time, people are just like, you're measuring it wrong.
Right. Well, you also have to give yourself a long enough time horizon too.
Oh, yeah.
Because I mean, if you're measuring your body weight every day, I mean, that's hydration status. I mean, there's a
Glycogen
whole
status.
Exactly. So there's a lot of other things that factors at play here, and it's just really hard to control for all of those.
It's a complicated case.
Yeah.
Lots of ins and outs, what have you. It's really hard to do. And anybody that's tried to delve into like using MyFitnessPal or an app like that, and we've even gotten our BMR tested, and you know, kind of like a number established, but
Basal metabolic rate, that's what he's saying.
Right.
but that doesn't mean that it's going to be the same all the time. Like that changes, right?
That's a really fun test to do, by the way.
Yeah.
It's like the best test ever.
That's my favorite one.
You lay down in a chair and you are not
That's it.
supposed to move.
You just sit
Yeah.
super still,
What, 30 minutes?
Something like that. I don't know. But
Yeah.
it was just relax.
Yeah.
chill
A-
out.
And it's funny too, if you ever go and get a BMR test and they aren't familiar with doing athletes, sometimes they'll question the results that they get from the test, something like that, just because, once again, athletes do have a higher rate. Friend of the podcast, Keegan, was just telling me that he got his tested and he had to come back 3 times because they were like, no, our machine's broken, the number's way off. But no, it was just the same.
What was his?
His was plus 2,000. It was like 21, something around there.
That's crazy for his size.
But
Because
see,
he's a
this is-
small person, but he does a lot of work.
Right. And this is a great example of applying that principle of if it's too good to be true, double check.
Yes, exactly.
So they're like, let's check and see if this is repeatable before we draw any conclusions, which,
Yep.
yeah.
Which they found it to be repeatable, so check.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
And
it's just complex.
Let me also state, I didn't get to this point. I should have that Carly, with a 230 watt FTP at 5.5 and 120, you're either eating a ton or you're very efficient.
Yeah,
Or maybe kind of somewhere down the middle there.
probably both.
But if anything, you're not lacking in efficiency.
And while you say like very efficient, it's a very narrow range. She's not like, if efficiency is like 23 to 26%, she's not suddenly 50% efficient.
Right.
And because then her FTP would be like 600 watts.
Yeah.
We talked about this before because you use most of your.
Amazing.
Yeah. It's still very tight range.
you use the majority of the caloric expenditure is going toward just thermoregulation, right? Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
It just goes out as heat.
Yeah, exactly. Kevin, let's get into Kevin's question. It's going to be the last one before we go into some of the live questions. And we'll try to keep it pretty short here. But Kevin says, interested in all of your answers, but this should be an especially good question for Pete. Once again, we just didn't have enough room for Pete. He's a large human in here, right? 4 of us already. It's packed. Yeah, come on in, Pete. But Pete will be jumping into the forum post on this one for sure. And I'm sure we can share plenty of stuff. During a road race that lasts 2 to 3 hours, Kevin says, does it make sense for riders on a smaller team, 3 to 5 riders, to initiate attacks when there is at least one other team with substantially more riders, 6, and he says in this case 6 to 9 riders? Or should the riders of a smaller team use more of a defensive strategy, mainly covering attacks as needed to minimize breakaways and maintain a position in the group that could allow for a strong race finish attack and hopefully podium finish and or win? So this is a very logical scenario of a small team versus a big team. Well, the big team should do more work is kind of what he's laying out here. Or should the small team kind of flip that whole model on its head? But it doesn't just come down to numbers.
No, it really depends.
I wish, because then we
be
just
so
have a really
simple.
big team and it would work, right? But it never just comes down to just pure numbers.
No, and one of the ways I like to think about racing tactics is what's the power balance and the power dynamic in the peloton. So if you get 5 of the strongest riders up the road in a breakaway, there's not as much power left in the peloton to chase that down. So it's a higher likelihood it's going to stick. Whereas if you get a bunch of riders in the breakaway and 2 of the strongest teams aren't represented there, so now it's in their best interest to chase that down. It's a lot of power that's really motivated, and that breakaway is not likely to stick. So I think a good way of thinking about this is what's the distribution of power in the race, and you can think about that also. What's the distribution of power in the team? Like, are you a team of 4 Ferraris and you're going up against 8 minivans? I mean, like in that case, I wouldn't worry about the numbers so much, right? Like they've got matches to burn, but each of those riders is not going to have as many matches to give. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. So if the other team is more powerful, it doesn't mean that you can't still create the race. So then you just need to figure out how to optimize the use of the power on your own team. And you can also look at ways to neutralize the power of the other team. So there's a lot of ways you can do this tactically. One of them is you get up the road. If you get one of your teammates up the road in a breakaway with one of their teammates, and your teammate in that breakaway has a better chance of winning than the other one, chances are they're probably not going to chase their teammate down because they've got representation in the break, but that's a great situation for you because you've just neutralized all of that power in the peloton, and yet you've set yourself up for a really good probability of winning the race. And by that, I mean your team. I just want to jump in here briefly for folks that aren't necessarily familiar with racing tactics. The analogy that I like to use with this is that racing tactics and road racing, at least, is like NASCAR, chess, and boxing. So
super simple, not complex.
Right, not complicated at all. It's really not, though. So it's like NASCAR in the sense that everybody's got an amount of energy to use. So you think about NASCAR, you show up with a full tank, and how are you going to use that fuel most efficiently to best optimize your chances of winning? And then it's like chess in the sense that if you're on a team, each of your chess pieces or teammates has specific strengths. So you want to utilize those strengths to the team objective. And then boxing, this is less so, but there's a lot of people in the group that are jockeying for position. And so I won't say that there's a lot of contact. There should never, we want to avoid contact, but it happens occasionally. But the part of this analogy that I really like about boxing is that same as with road racing, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. Yeah. So
Mike Tyson.
It's good to go in with a plan. And I think that in terms of planning, especially if you're a smaller team, you want to assess key points in the race. So look at your rider strengths. So who's good at positioning? Who's good at tactical savvy? If it's not a selective course, tactics are going to play a huge role. So maybe you really want to you want to use the riders on your team who are really tactically savvy. Are there climbs, ascending? Figure out how your chess pieces are going to best play to those. Again, like I said earlier today, you want to look at what are the selection points in the race. So if there are key points in the race, like if there's a huge climb or, again, a technical section, which of your riders is most likely to make all of those selections to the end? And then you want to use the rest of the team's strengths to set them up for those. And then also consider the race characteristics. Is this a course you've done before? What are the typical dynamics? What's typically selective on the course? How does the field typically race?
Yeah,
is there even a pattern?
Sometimes it can it's you can just count on it being really similar.
Right.
And that's a big help.
Yes, especially if you're racing regional or local races where you know the field really well, you know how team dynamics work. The other thing is, just because they're a team doesn't mean that they're going to race like a team. So you do see a lot of people out there in the same kit, and you would think that they might employ team tactics, but they're not always going to do that. And usually you can detect patterns, and you can kind of count on how people are going to race and use that to your benefit to inform your tactical strategy.
Sorry, one quick thing on this. Nate just looked put off. There's a huge difference. Like what you said is so important. There's a big difference between a functional team and a non-functional team.
Oh, yeah.
And there's even like the assumption that like, oh, well, the pros always have functional teams. But I remember that year when Quick Step was like constantly a ton of numbers at the front at the end of the races, and they couldn't clinch, right? And they were getting bested by smaller teams or even single riders amongst their team.
Right.
So when you talk about like a team, an amateur team can work better than a pro team.
Yes.
It really just matters like the chemistry and everybody knowing the relative strengths, the course, all that stuff. The stuff you just talked about, if everybody did that, they would be a good team.
Yeah.
Right? Because then they'd kind of understand all the principles that go into it. So if you do have a team, make them listen to that section. We'll make this into a short clip.
I would say in general, and sorry everybody, but this is what my experience, but in the lower categories, the more numbers you have, the less likely you are to work as a team.
Yes.
Because it's usually a club where it's just like everyone just signs up and they're just riding together. And then the different in P1 too. Because P1 2, they like, that's legit teamwork.
Yeah.
But sometimes like two Mike's Bikes guys control the whole field when there's all these other teams with 9 people. They're not doing anything.
And that's
tough.
going back to the power dynamic. Just
Yep.
because they have the numbers doesn't mean they have the power. And the power is not just about the strength of each rider.
Yes.
It's how well they're working together. So if they're not employing team tactics,
Yeah.
If there's 9 people just riding along in the field, they don't impact the race either, even if they are the most powerful.
Right.
2 Mike's guys or I think it was 3, one of my races, and they would one guy would just roll off the front and attack, and then no one else would attack, and the Mike's bike guys would ride at tempo. And there's all these
Controlling the
teams.
race.
Yeah, right? There's probably like 3 teams of 9 people,
Yeah.
and nothing happened.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, riding as a team is so much fun. So if you're on one of those club teams and you don't really work on team tactics, give it a shot.
Yeah.
Because it's an opportunity for every single person on the team to contribute something and to work on process goals. So oftentimes my job wasn't to win the race, but my job was to set someone else up to win. So for me, that might be working on the process goal of positioning or, leading out into a climb or whatever it is. And it's a great opportunity for personal growth and learning. Especially on a course that doesn't favor you. And it gives you a sense of purpose. And it's, oh my gosh, it's so much fun.
Makes it a whole different sport.
It's so much
really
So
fun.
much
does.
more fun, so much
Yeah.
more rewarding.
Yeah, and if you can, and drilling that sort of stuff in practice
Oh my
really is
gosh.
what, because we're all familiar with like a lead out, for example.
Oh, yeah.
We're all familiar with like the concept of a lead out. Well, if you're not, basically a team rides in a line of all the riders they have available, and they ride at a pace that is intended to guarantee the best delivery for their sprinter to the line, right? So that usually means that riders are exhausting themselves while pushing the wind. So then they peel off, and then the next rider peels off, and then hopefully it's the perfect distance for your sprinter, and he goes and wins. We're all familiar with the concept, but in terms of and we know what it looks like, but then when we try to execute it, it's really tough. Like these sort of things take...
You get punched in the face.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It takes a lot of drilling and making sure
Not
that
literally.
it all works.
Not literally.
Yeah. Hopefully, you don't get punched. Yeah, exactly.
So this is again, it's different in P1 too, but in the lower categories, so often do I see a lead out be a group of same jerseyed riders riding like club pace.
Yeah.
Like the first person is not drilling it. They're going they're just pretty much lining up rather than like going as hard as they can.
They know what they've got the appearance right.
Yes, and they don't have a sprinter. Right?
Yeah. That's the other thing. If you're leading out somebody that can't clinch,
So Amber, what is the point of a lead out?
So the point of a lead out, number 1 is to keep your sprinter in ideal position. And number 2, to discourage or make impossible attacks. So if you're doing a really good lead out, the people who are initiating or doing, whoever's on the front is in a dead sprint. They might be doing a seated sprint because they might have to do 500 to 300 meters, but each person ideally would do no more than 500 meters, and you're going as fast as you possibly can so that it's actually physically impossible for somebody to attack around you. Like you're just putting out that much power. And then when you're done, you peel off and then the next person takes over. So if your job is to be a part of that lead out and not be the sprinter, you've identified a finish line for yourself, which is well ahead of the actual finish line. So if you're the last person dropping off your sprinter, you've talked to your sprinter ahead of time and they want to be dropped off at 200 meters or 150 meters, depending on what their sprint is like. That's your finish line. And you should hit that point completely empty. Completely empty. And so it's a lot of fun when you can really execute it.
And I think a lot of people, what they don't do is they go, like they're metering themselves to the finish. Like they're going 23 or 25, and an attack can come at 33
Yes.
miles per hour. So if you're like the tacks late in the race, I've done some of them, and you see in that cat 2-to-1, when there's a big speed differential, it's easy.
Yeah.
Like that's when you can really get the separation. Not easy, but you have a higher chance. But if they're going 30, and someone going all out should be able to go 30 or above for a lead out, and you can have a last lap at 30 miles per hour. If you're not in the right position, oh man, is it hard to move up.
Oh, it's really brutal.
And then you're going to have to sprint, which is really hard after you've moved up on that.
Yeah.
And then for Amber's team, that rider is in the draft, probably behind Amber. Bigger draft than other women.
Right. That's right.
And she's 5'10".
I got hired for my draft.
Exactly. But I mean, and then you can come and that person can sprint without all the other stuff. But if you're just like going and you're just riding in a row, and the lead person, you can say anything. Like you said, you should be going all the way out.
It's
mean, you
like
should-
it's like the worst thing you could do to your sprinter is to do like a bad lead out like that, because then it puts them in a situation where they're trusting something that just isn't going to work out, and those attacks are going to go around. Then they have to
Then they get
decide.
swarmed.
Yeah, and then they have to they get swarmed, or they have to decide. Well, do I just forego all of what's going on here, or do I? Is a teammate going to try to pull me up here? What's going to happen? It's
Or people just go like a hard, like a little bit over threshold, but not all out.
It should be hard enough so that nobody can come around
then
you, like you said, Amber.
And
Yeah.
the worst is when you do that, and then you see like another line coming up on your right. You're like, how is that happening?
Don't do that. We're going hard.
No, but I mean, yeah.
Well, you almost have to ride with the intention of shedding everybody.
Yeah.
Don't even care if your sprinter's going to hang on, because if your sprinter doesn't hang on, your sprinter doesn't deserve to be your sprinter.
Exactly. That's
So
your sprinter's
get in front
job.
of them and drill it. Try to drop them. I mean, you're not literally trying to drop them, but don't hold back at all.
No, there's no holding back.
You're trying to drop everyone else.
Yeah, exactly. And then even if somebody's attacking, you've got 3 more people lined up who are going to come into the wind fresh versus that person who's trying to match you, or even if they're going a little bit faster than you are, they're going to blow up.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
See, you have to practice this. You have to practice it.
Yes.
Even if you just have a 2-person lead out, I mean, it's you and your sprinter. It has to be practiced. If you have more people, it has to be practiced. You can't show up to a race and say, okay, you're going to be first, you're going to be second, you're going to be third, you're going to be fourth, and then so-and-so is going to sprint on your wheel. If that's the level of your preparedness, don't expect anything to work.
The
Right.
order is so important, and for amateurs and pros. For pros, we commonly see it put in practice, but for amateurs too, it's extremely important, because once again, when you're talking about, you're riding as hard as you can, and if that means that if one rider is able to hold your wheel when you're riding as fast as you can,
another
then
thing
still
that
be
has to
able to
be determined.
contribute, then that person goes behind you, right? Like it's all set up. That's why you'll find sprinters like Cav that have Mark Renshaw as their person, partially because of trust in the relationship, but also because his power profile and ability, like Nate mentioned, your 1 minute power is something that's like particularly good, right?
Right.
So
They're great in a lead out. Yeah.
so they're very complementary. Those two riders have found a match.
And that's very high level competition. I mean, you can take it all the way down to 4 or 5 racing. And if you have 2 or 3 riders who can work really well together, you can do a lot.
Yeah.
Yes.
Especially if you check out the
High
finish
success rate.
and you know, like, okay, our sprinter has to be first out of this corner, or I'm gonna lead you through this corner, then I'm gonna open the door, and then
Sometimes
you
you
go.
define that's the job for you. You need to
That's
get
it.
our sprinter to that last corner. That's
your
all
finish
you
line.
have to do. So over the course of that last lap, you got to bury yourself to make sure that happens.
I watch a ton of first-person race videos on YouTube, and the only team that I've seen do this well, I mean, usually it's a even in the P12s, it's a 2-person lead out or a 3-person at most.
Yeah. Mhm.
But Legion, the Williams Brothers team,
yes,
Oh,
that's
they're-
incredible.
they do it for like 5 or 6 laps, and they are gunning it so hard, and
Yeah.
no one can attack.
No one can do anything.
What they do is they'll put Justin and
Neutralize it.
Corey together, and then they'll put someone on whoever, like Corey or Justin's wheel behind that.
Sweet.
And that person will drop the wheel in
Yes.
the sprint. So before the last corner, they will have like a little bit of gap. So then you have to make up 3 spaces, and then Justin or Corey just explode, and now it's suddenly out of the corner. It's a 6 wheel gap.
And how many times do you think
can't
they
close
practice that?
Right.
Oh,
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
They are good at it. But other people, even Taron Cycling with NorCal Cycling with Justin or Jeff Linder. Sorry, Jeff. A lot of his videos too. It'll be a 1 or 2-person lead out, and that is
Usually
enough to win a
is.
P12
Yeah.
race
Yeah,
if they get a jump.
Right.
And
Positioning.
exactly. The other thing, mentioning this, who did this very well is Jonathan Lee in Land Park, my first Cat
that's
3
right.
race.
Awesome.
You
was
went
fun.
on the backside as hard as you can. He went so hard, he strung out the whole field. I was on his wheel. He was 1, I was 2. We dropped a 5 watt per kilo, smaller person, on my draft from my wheel as he was leading out.
yeah,
awesome.
Right?
It's
And that
the
caused
point of going
separation.
all in.
Yep. And then when he on the backside, we were 60 seconds from the finish. When you gave up, you could not pedal anymore. It
wasn't possible.
He was like,
That's a good
falling
instance where
apart.
people can actually see how fast a real lead out is.
Yeah.
When they just can't muster the commitment to even hang on to a lead out, that blows minds, and that
Yep.
reshapes perspectives. People
Right.
understand now, oh man, I have to do
That's what I
that.
have to
it's the
Really?
sprint. The sprint started early.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how good did that feel, Jonathan?
Oh, it's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
very
but once
rewarding.
again,
So rewarding.
To your point, Amber, like we knew the course.
Yep.
We knew the relative strengths. Like Nate, we knew that I had to get Nate within a minute of the finish, right? Because that's
Said
where
that
Nate
before.
does really
He
well.
said, drop me off right there, and then he did it. It was awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. So it worked
so
out.
fun when that happens.
But if Nate wasn't able to deliver, then it's still still my job to do that regardless.
Yeah.
But if Nate wasn't able to deliver,
I got dropped.
if he couldn't hold on to that sort of thing, that's the tricky part that I see a lot of amateurs kind of like, well, our sprinter can't hold on, so we should go easier. But honestly, you're probably going to lose if that's the case.
That's not your sprinter.
Yep, that's not your sprinter, or your sprinter needs to do more.
Or you need to be working for a breakaway.
And I've seen
again,
that.
why you have to practice this, because you have to have belief in everyone who's on your wheel. This will
Well,
be worth it.
The other thing is, not to add too much complexity, but in an ideal scenario, the team gets together within the field and then you just hit it and you explode out of the field. You're not lining up at the front and organizing and then
Everybody-
ramping up the speed. Right.
what we're gonna do.
Like,
We're going to go really hard soon.
so the communication that's involved in finding each other's wheels, getting in order, and then executing is really hard. The other piece of this is, as you're doing that, everybody's fighting for your wheels, because if they know that you have a good lead out, everybody's trying to get in on the train because it's going fast. People are desperate to find a draft. So part of the technique of it is, how do you keep somebody from taking, if I'm in a lead out and I have my teammate's wheel in front of me, etiquette says, etiquette, air quotes, says that, that's my wheel, it's my teammate's wheel. Etiquette goes out the window when you're talking about a sprint finish.
Punched in the face.
I know it. Got to plan until you get punched in the face.
Yeah, sprinters got to be willing to fight for wheels. That's for
Right.
dang sure.
But you also have to, as a team, be really good at protecting each other's wheels. Yeah. And then that sweeper that you were talking about, that's part of it. They're keeping other people from being on your sprinter's wheel. And even if they don't open a gap to your sprinter's wheel, the fact that they're there means that anyone who's behind them has to come around a full
many
bike
riders.
length just to get to your sprinter's wheel. So you don't want your sprinter leading out another sprinter, and that's another function that the sweeper can provide. So, it's a lot of fun.
Pretty cool stuff.
I highly recommend.
I just want to race right now.
I know, right?
It's going to be fun this year. It's going to be a blast. Nate and
ridiculously
I aren't
fun.
even we aren't going to talk about the races we're going to do this year.
It's going to show up.
Yep. And you
Well,
won't.
pre-reg, but
That's true. It's on the
But
record.
because hopefully, well, who knows? You all listen and then you show up and then you just mark us and it's kind of hard. So
Just means you have to raise your game.
yeah, that's it. That's it. Just be faster. We'll do it. Okay, let's get into some live questions that have been submitted from YouTube. We've covered this before, but any pro tips for continuing your training when traveling overseas? We'll be going away for a couple of weeks in the spring with my bike, and I'm looking to reduce the impact of the travel break, looking to utilize Trainer Road's outdoor workouts.
do that.
100%. That's a good way to do it. We actually, Pete and I, when we were riding this weekend, there was a rider that was, getting started on the side of the road when we were coming down on a climb, and then he latched onto our wheel and rode with us. And turns out he was a Trainer Road user, and he was mentioning the fact that he's been in Boston for school, and then he's here for Christmas vacation, and he has been doing following his plan, just doing outside workouts every day, and he was just like in heaven. It helps a ton. So, Nate?
Yeah, I just had a thought.
Yeah.
We get to review our New Year's resolutions next time, Chad.
If that'll bring you some satisfaction, I guess so. Let's do it. I don't even remember them.
But I have a.
got him down in the
well,
dock.
that's not good if you never remember.
It's going to be a bit of a buzzkill for you.
Why would it be a buzzkill for me?
Okay,
Okay,
I'm
so
not going to give you any gratitude.
you already are, Chad. The thing that I think, I'm trying to think of what mine would be, and I think it's going to be take my bike when I travel, because when I travel, you can see in my history, there's all these weeks of nothing, and it's just like it's so tough to come back from that every time you get knocked back in training. Either bring a trainer. On the Feedback Sports one's a really good trainer to bring. The Omnium, I think that's what it's called.
Super portable. That's why it's good for that.
A lot of times you might be at an event in the middle of a city, and it might start at 8 a.m. I can't go ride for many hours, and could be dark and that sort of thing. Or I mean, if you're traveling overseas and you can ride outside, like we did at Eurobike and go to Austria, that's an amazing experience. But a lot of times I'm just a small fan, and a trainer that can fit in your bike bag, and everything is a pain, but I'm gonna try it.
Or if you're going to rent bikes, travel with a saddle, pedals, and shoes, so that you're bringing your
Really good
contact
idea.
points with you.
And what we've done before too is if you have power pedals, you can bring them to the gym bike. I've also done that. That can also be nice, especially if there's a spin bike and you have to bring the right kind of tools. But you can, like a spin type bike that has a big flywheel, you can do a trainer workout on those bikes.
Yeah.
I did that I went to a Mexico resort place and they had one of those bikes. I did every workout on that. 45 minutes, made them really intense, and it was awesome.
Yeah. You can always find whatever workout you have. If you need to make alterations because the schedule's weird, there's always minus versions that you can find, or shorter versions is probably a better thing to say because minus doesn't necessarily mean.
That's another tip is that, like, I'm doing sweet spot base high volume. I would never do that during traveling, like 2-hour sweet spot workouts.
Right.
Or actually, my wife's doing it's either Goofy or Dopey challenge. You do a 5K, 10K, half marathon over 4 days at Disney World coming up.
Whoa.
Yeah. That's like less volume than she normally does.
Yeah, Greta's impressive.
Not a big deal.
Yeah,
It's an easy week.
And then she's going to walk around Disney World the whole time like a border collie.
Burning more energy.
Churros. I'm going to try to do, like I said, like 45 minutes, and I'm actually going to skip it. So I'm not going to do a 45-minute sweet spot. I'm going to do like VO2 max work, take advantage of sea level, and we have well, I shouldn't mention it, but the race season starts.
Yes.
I'm going to be at Kalaki, so.
Yeah. One thing to add to your point, Amber, really good one there of bringing your saddle and all that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Get objective measurements that just cross
bottom bracket.
that don't depend on the bike. Meaning from center of bottom bracket to where your sit bone goes on the saddle. And you can make like a little line on your saddle if you need.
You might even want to do cranks because when you rent a bike, you're not really in control of the crank length.
Yes.
Right. So it might be pedal spindle to
that's a good point.
To
the top of the saddle where your sit bones hit. And I only do that because sometimes then the seat post angle is weird. And also you can do from your center of your bottom bracket or your pedals basically, or this one's probably good, center of your bottom bracket up to your hands.
Yeah.
And if you can figure that out, then you can kind of put things in the right place.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. As a pro, I always had my saddle height and setback memorized because if you need a spare bike in the middle of the race, I mean, if it was a team mechanic, they would have the saddle heights of each of the riders on the team on the spare bike, so they would just get it right there immediately. But it's a good thing to just know in general.
Yeah.
Or if you have like a little card, you can draw out a schematic of your bike and label all the lengths, take a picture of it with your phone, boom, you have it with you all the time.
Okay, we're just going to do a couple more. One of them is tactics for small fields. Question for Amber, what is your recommended approach for amateur women's races that generally have small field sizes in most areas? A lot of these tactical discussions may not apply to small fields.
That's really true. And it also, I mean, I love the team tactics, but it doesn't always apply because not everybody has a team.
Yeah.
And if you're a solo rider, and there may not even be a full team in a race. You might just have, pairs or trios of riders in the same kit. But the principles all remain the same. So again, I would go inspect the finish, figure out what your strengths are. So Nate knows he's got a really good 1-minute power. So he might identify a spot on the course that would be a good place for him to theoretically go. And I say theoretically because you still have to read the dynamics of the race.
Right.
But have a couple of plans in mind. So know that if you're coming into the finish in a field sprint, have a visual, whether it's a fire hydrant or a tree or a speed limit sign, have a visual of where you think you might want to open up your sprint, and then identify selected places in the race. And I've talked with a lot of collegiate racers about this because I think collegiate fields are similar to this. So get on Google Earth, Ride with GPS, I think has a really nice format where you can actually trace a race route and see where you are on the profile so you can see where there's climbs. Look at the map, see if there's like a little chicane. You can use Google Earth to investigate corners. All of these things can help you identify selective points in the race. And once you've identified the selective point in the race, figure out, okay, is it selective because of climb? Okay, you want to be near the front of that climb. Usually, if you're going into a selective point in the course, you want to be near the front. So some of these are just really principle things. And so you can think of racing tactics as every race is going to be a series of selections. There may be more, there may be less. There may be no selections and you come into then the finish is the final selection. So just assess your own strengths, figure out what you need to do to make each of those selections to put yourself in the best position for the finish. And again, knowing your competitors really helps with that. So if you know that somebody's really good at positioning and you're coming into a technical section, you might want to be on that person's wheel. So all of those things can kind of help you apply. But I think the biggest thing is debrief after the races. So we do this here with the race analysis videos. This is a great thing to do with friends. If you have somebody watching you race, sit down and break down the tactics at the end with them, talk through it, because solidifying that in your memory is going to help you apply those lessons in the future.
And there's a difference between doing that objectively and then doing it with kind of rose-colored lenses, so to speak. Because every time after...
Sick, bro. That was sick.
Yeah, that was sick.
All those attacks you did.
Yeah, those are great, yeah. But if you just go after the race, because it's a human thing to think of that you did things right and that everything else outside of you was wrong. And you hear a lot of the time in a post race, like, oh, that person cut me off, or oh,
I would have won except for the 30 people that crossed the line ahead of me.
Yeah. So instead of looking at it from that perspective, like the way that you're supposed to look at it is, what could I have done to improve, rather than looking at it like what caused me to miss out, right?
Right. Or what you did right, but be really honest with yourself about what really worked, what really didn't work. I think that's a good point. And so talking with somebody that you can have that honest conversation with is really, really important. You just said something else that reminded me. I'll think of it in a minute. Sorry.
In the middle of my race, it's going to start happening with Amber too, but I'm like, oh, Pete's not going to like what I just did.
Yes.
I'm like, oh, no.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Sorry. I remember what I was going to say. So the better you get at any sport or endeavor, the more aware you will become of your mistakes. Mm-hmm. This is a great thing because it will enable you to improve more and more quickly. But keep in mind that the more aware it can actually kind of be detrimental, because it can get to a point where you're so aware of your mistakes that you think that you're actually getting worse, which is where it helps to have somebody who's more objective to say, yeah, like, you're more aware of your mistakes than you ever have been before, but in the bigger picture, that's what's enabling you to improve. So, yeah.
Especially when you get to P1-2 racing or anything else like that, when winning becomes a rarity.
A lot harder.
That's
when it really helps to have a team.
Yeah, and absolutely. With that, we'll end on that. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we appreciate you all so much. Enjoy the holidays, and if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't tried Trainer Road, give it a shot. It'll make you faster, or share this podcast. If everybody listening to this did this now, that would really help, because it would make a lot of other people faster. Hopefully, it'll make you faster too, so don't worry if you're racing them. So with all that said, thank you so much, and we'll see you all at the next podcast. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays.
Bye-bye.
Bye.